This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome to today's meeting of the Housing Committee. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on social media and use the hashtag London Housing for this meeting. Please may I remind you to silence your devices, and can I ask guests and members to position your mics so that they can be heard clearly, moving it closer to you by picking it up from the base if required. Our main item of business this afternoon is temporary accommodation in London. So can I ask our clerk, Diane Richards, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assemblymember Sheikh, for whom Assemblymember Baker is substituting, and our chairman has been slightly delayed, so we have our deputy chair in the chair.
Okay, thank you. So as you can all see, I am not Lord Bailey. I'm the deputy chair and will be taking some of the questions, and one of our guests, Kwajo, will be arriving, so I'll just start with all of you and then we'll see how the meeting progresses. So first of all, to all three of you, oh, I apologise. Okay, we'll just backtrack, apologies. Can I ask the committee to note... No? No? Yes. Okay. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any interests to declare?
Noted. Noted.
Okay. And can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 19th of October 2023? Can we note the outstanding actions from previous meetings?
Noted.
And can we note the recent action taken by the Chair and under delegated authority in consultation with party group leads, which was to agree the Committee's Affordable Housing Monitor 2023. Okay, So before I come to questions to all of you, I would like to start by thanking the Setting the Standard Inspections team for arranging a temporary accommodation visit for the committee to Luke House to support this investigation, and that took place earlier this autumn. And I would also like to thank everybody who took the time to reply to the call for evidence for this as well. So if I could formally introduce you all. So we have Jamie Thunder, Policy and Public Affairs Officer at Zacchaeus 2000 Trust. Maria Morgan, Executive Director of Kinera Community Interest Company. Kwajo Tweneboa, Social Housing Activist, who will join us. And Lucy Holmes, Creating Change Director at Groundswell. Right, to the questions. So to all of you, what's the biggest issue of concern in temporary accommodation in London, and what have you been seeing and hearing on the ground? So perhaps we'll start with Jamie.
Thank you. It's very difficult to give one issue. They're all rather interlinked. I think probably one of the single most common issues that we see is location of property. We see a lot of people being placed out of borough, particularly from central London boroughs, which can be a very long way from where they live, where they work, where their children are at school. That causes a great deal of disruption and difficulty, and particularly for more vulnerable households who might then also struggle to find the same access to healthcare and related support as well.
Thank you. Maria?
Hi. I think the level of the state of the temporary accommodation that we're seeing, the level of disrepair, the unsafe surroundings that young children and families are experiencing living in temporary accommodation. And I think also a growing concern is the number of private rented landlords who are taking back their properties. That is a growing issue that is happening, that is having another level of impact of accessible housing within the housing sector as well.
And just before I move on, when you say private landlords are taking back their properties, do you have a sense of whether they're selling them or whether they're renting them at a higher rent?
In terms of the London Council, who's done a big research on what's going on in temporary accommodation across the borough, that is something that is still being looked at and need more exploring. But what we see is that landlords are selling their properties. But that, again, is a piece of research that needs more investigation of where and what's happening.
Thank you. And finally to you, Lucy.
Thank you. Groundswell as an organisation works primarily with single people rather than families with children, and so we're quite concerned at the increasing numbers of single people living with insufficient support in temporary accommodation. And we are focused very much on people's health and well-being. We're seeing increasing complexity of people's health challenges, significant barriers people face to being able to access appropriate healthcare whilst living in temporary accommodation. And of course that's linked to two things. Primarily they are the quality and appropriateness of the accommodation, and they are its temporary nature, the fact of it being a temporary accommodation that gets in the way of people being able to thrive.
Thank you all. My next question, as I said, we had a visit this autumn in September to visit a temporary accommodation provider who was rated satisfactory, but it was clear that puts them in a minority of providers in London in that band. So why are standards of temporary accommodation so poor, in your opinion? And do you think that standards are worse in London or better in comparison to other parts of the country? Right, let's start with Maria this time.
I think that there is a high demand for properties, and when you have a high demand for properties, the properties that are in the market have a lot of choice of and a lot of people that need that property. And so I think there is something about demand as well, and how do you manage that demand? And also with the council, they are dealing with such a housing emergency on all fronts, and to be able to put a demand on the private rented sector to raise their standard, it puts them in a contrary in terms of we need properties, but we don't want to put too much pressure on the market, because if they withdraw their properties, which we see is happening, where are we left? So I think that's that cost of living, cost of materials. So there is a holistic issue that is happening that has an impact on the conditions of property, but the responsiveness of that is compromised on so many levels of what I've just described.
Thank you. Jamie, would you like to go next?
Thank you. Yeah. ZTK only works in London in terms of our advice, so I can't really speak about the situation in other parts of the country. I think one issue that drives poor standards is relating to the supply, but also the funding available to local authorities, the housing subsidy from central government for temporary accommodation, which has been frozen, I believe, since 2011. That obviously has, combined with wider reductions in local authority spending power, means that local authorities are looking for properties that are basically below market rate. Now, that is, and often the reason for that is quality, which is a sad fact. We see people with disability, we have clients with disabilities where the council accepts that the property isn't suitable for them, that it's or that it's in a state of disrepair, but they're not able to find an appropriate property for them. So I think part of this is the way that funding works. That means that if you have a poor quality accommodation, you can find somebody who will pay for it.
So the basic issue, from your perspective, your organisations, is that it's entirely driven by what's available at the price point that LHA offers? The TA subsidy, yes. Okay, great, thank you. And welcome, Kwajo. Give you some time to catch your breath. If we can come to Lucy, please, on the same question.
Thank you. There are lots of different things in the way of people's health and well-being which are of particular concern to us. So Jamie mentioned the inappropriate accommodation that's often offered to people, particularly people with disabilities. I know it's also been raised to you in your call for evidence, the issue of local authorities not making suitable adaptations to properties because they are meant to be temporary. But the fact that people then stay in these properties for a very long time means that people are living without adaptations that could be relatively straightforward to put in place. We've been calling for increased and better and enforceable regulation of standards within temporary accommodation properties, and also better access to legal advice, because people don't have access to advice that would allow them to push back when they're experiencing poor quality accommodation. There's an issue that Groundswell's been working on recently with UCL that I think it's worth bearing in mind. It doesn't apply to all temporary accommodation, but it's the issue of the change to permitted development rights, which took place 10 years ago in 2013, which has allowed development and change of use from, for example, office or industrial buildings to residential. It's very difficult for us to track it, actually, and we don't know how much temporary accommodation is being provided within buildings changed of use through PDR. But this research we're doing with UCL has been raising quite a lot of concern around this, and certainly people living in not just poor quality renovated properties, but in inappropriate locations. Jamie mentioned people being moved out of borough, but often these PDR properties are in industrial areas. They don't have infrastructure, they don't have local amenity. There are issues with temperature control. People find it very difficult to keep those sorts of properties cool enough in hot weather, which has a big impact on your well-being. They have issues with noise from outside and from within buildings if they're poorly insulated. There's quite a lot of evidence on this and more emerging, but we struggle to know how much of it exists and is being used for TA. We've talked a little bit about the sort of lack of move on that's available, and that's why people are staying in temporary accommodation for long periods. That is something that is different within London. People in London are staying in temporary accommodation longer than people who live in other areas of the country. But Groundswell works with people all over England, and we hear very similar issues people facing with their temporary accommodation. So I think it's the length of stay that really marks London out as particularly bad in this arena.
How does it compare then, the length of stay in London compared to outside of London?
Shelter did some work, and I believe, and they released their report Still Living in Limbo earlier this year, and I believe that they found that people in London were staying significantly longer. Oh, sorry, Maria, go ahead.
Some research saying about over the 6 weeks, and that's emergency accommodation. And around about 5 years, I've heard from a school that we're working with, they have 20% of their families are living in temporary accommodation. Some living there for 5 years.
Basically finishing school in TA, okay. All right, thank you.
And we know of people who are in our volunteer pool, or the clients that we're working with who've been in temporary accommodation for 6, 7, 8 more years than that, which is a very long time when you also consider that people who live in temporary accommodation might expect to be moved out of it with very little notice. And again, Shelter's research found a large proportion of people had been given around 48 hours notice when they moved from their last placement. So it's a very tricky position to be somewhere for a very long time, but know that it could, you might be moving with very little notice. And the research that we've just done with people living in TA in London found that sense of it could end any minute is a significant barrier to people putting down roots, engaging with the local community, the amenities in the area, local health services. That's why people stay registered with their GP in another borough or in another area, or their dentist that they've had, kids' schools.
Thank you so much. If I could put the same question to you, Kwajo. So we were just talking about a visit that we made as a committee to a TA provider which met a satisfactory standard. But the question was why standards of temporary accommodation are very often poor, and whether or not, in your opinion, standards are lower or worse in London than other parts of the country.
From my experience in regards to temporary accommodation, absolutely. I'd go as far to say it's an absolute disgrace, the conditions we have our temporary homes in, especially in London, but beyond. And I think it's a mixture of problems. I've witnessed it myself. I was in temporary accommodation that happened to be a converted car garage only a few years ago. And I've spoken to many, many families in absolutely shocking conditions. And the irony about temporary accommodation is there's nothing temporary about temporary accommodation, especially now. Things were difficult 10 years ago, 12 years ago even, when I sort of started out, was in social housing, having issues. Things are a lot worse now. And what's difficult about being in temporary accommodation is those individuals are absolutely desperate. These are individuals that effectively would otherwise be out on the street and homeless. And what I have noticed, and I myself have had to actually turn up to local authorities with individuals or tenants that have been evicted are homeless, in order to prove that they have a case in order to be provided with temporary accommodation. And I have a feeling that's only going to increase because of the shortage of temporary accommodation. And then when they are provided with that temporary accommodation, it's often poor quality. I often highlight cases of poor quality within social housing, and many of those videos have been in temporary accommodation. I've witnessed it myself in temporary accommodation with damp and mould and all of these sorts of other issues that you expect. And what's even more so difficult for residents in temporary accommodations is there's this feeling that it's unacceptable and you should not, as a human being, be placed in these conditions. In some cases, so obviously wrong and inhumane to be placed. I mean, not even fit for animals to be living in. But two, also, you realise you are in temporary accommodation, and what you don't want to do is be seen to be complaining in case, for some reason, you are kicked off that list, or for some reason you're not provided with social housing, or you become too much of a nuisance to those individuals that you're dealing with. So I think it's a mixture of problems, but within we know we've got a housing crisis, not just in London but beyond. We also know we've got a social housing crisis, which is extremely acute at the moment. But we often overlook this idea of temporary accommodation and the role it has to play within this social housing crisis, and it's absolutely huge. And like I mentioned, it's desperate and vulnerable individuals that by the point you're moved into temporary accommodation, you're probably already struggling with your mental health, perhaps even your physical health. Look at the amount of kids that are homeless in England, 131,000. Many of them will be in temporary accommodation, and many of them will be in London. So it's not just the impact on individuals or individual adults within temporary accommodation, it's the impact on the education of young kids, their physical and mental health. Yet for some reason there is not enough support there. First of all, we haven't got enough temporary accommodation, and secondly, there's not enough support there for residents who are living in poor conditions in temporary accommodation. They simply don't feel like they don't have a voice.
Okay. Thank you for that. I'm going to ask you briefly the first question that we asked before you arrived, which relates to what you just said, which is, from your experience, what are the biggest issues of concern in TA that you've been seeing and hearing about? You've touched on a few things, but are there kind of recurring issues?
Yeah, there is. I mean, the conditions, the disrepair within temporary accommodation, also the lack of support for residents that feel like they want to complain. They too feel like they haven't got enough support on their side. So there will be many cases where people think they should just put up and shut up, quite frankly. And again, I'm speaking from first-hand experience with this. We've got situations where people have been put in incredibly poor conditions in regards to, like I mentioned, a converted car garage. No human being should be in a converted car garage, and it was poorly converted at that. And that was, 2017, because I remember watching Grenfell happening on BBC News in the morning afterwards, and thinking, like, we should not be in these conditions. People in social housing, those that are homeless, should not be living like this. But also the impact on their health and mental health. I mean, it's extremely bad within temporary accommodation. Often when I speak to people, residents in social housing, poor conditions, temporary accommodation, they are already suffering with anxiety, depression, all brought on because of their living conditions, and often worried about their jobs, whether they can maintain their jobs, but also their kids' education. And there's a lot of kids, a lot of children who are having to live in these conditions.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to our next Assembly Member. So Assembly Member Davenish, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, panel. Can I start with Kwajo, and then Maria, and then Kanara? Apologies if my pronunciation's been poor. In London, how do people's experience of TA differ at local level, including across boroughs, please? You just start at the end and work down.
Thank you. We do see some differences between boroughs. I think it would be fair to say that's broadly a difference between inner and outer London boroughs, which I think relates to the degree of pressure on and the number of homelessness presentations in those different boroughs. I think to a very large extent, all London boroughs have very similar underlying pressures on their systems that doesn't vary a huge amount borough to borough. In our experience.
Thank you.
I think the same as Jamie. All London boroughs are feeling the pressure of the situation that we are in right now, and the amount of people that are needing to be housed, and the conditions of temporary accommodation is a problem across London. We know that London housing boroughs are spending a lot of money on temporary accommodation, and for that reason, these conversations are so important, and it needs to be highlighted, because the conditions that people are living in. I don't want to go off the question, but we have a family that was living in a rat-infested property. They had to move into a kitchen with their 7-month-old baby, and the 7-month-old baby had to stay in their travel cot because they could not move around the accommodation. I have pictures of rats and mice in their food. and it stunts the baby's growth. We spent a lot of time trying to raise this, and eventually the family was moved, and the development of their child was so different than what it was. He's running up and down. You cannot keep him still because he's moving, which he was not doing before. He had to stay in the kitchen in a cot. So because it wasn't safe. And this is a child protection issue.
Roger?
I'd like to lead on Yeah, I need to remember that. I want to lead on from that point that Maria made, because it's very, very valid and something that I've seen time and time again, especially within temporary accommodation. I mean, the question about does it vary from borough to borough? It does vary, but I'm not talking about from good to bad. I'm talking about from bad to absolutely outrageously bad. I think that is a fair and accurate portrayal of what I've seen, especially, and things would be a lot worse, I think, in London, of course, because it's the capital and we have so many more people here, but there's situations where people's health and safety is quite right, I mean, like Maria's situation, directly put at risk because of the conditions that are having to live in within temporary accommodation. And it's not only, I think, a temporary accommodation or social housing crisis. I think we need to start looking at it as a human rights issue too, because everyone should have the right to live in a decent and safe home. But when we're talking about rat-infested homes where families are having to move into their kitchen, or in my cases where people are living with 10 years with cockroaches and all other issues, damp, mould, having their health and safety directly put at risk because of the situation and conditions they're having to live in, we need to start addressing this issue as a human rights crisis rather than just a housing crisis, and dealing with it individually. We should be dealing with temporary accommodation separate to the social housing crisis, because look how much money we're spending in London alone on hotels, and tenants are having to be moved every 28 days or expected to move every 28 days with their belongings from hotel room to hotel room, hotel to hotel. How can people expect to function? I think long-term solutions need to be created now, because clearly we're failing and we're wasting a lot of money in doing so.
Okay, thank you. The next question I'll start with Lucy, because and work our way down on the panel, and it's quite similar, but it's a three-parter. So, what has your experience been on engaging with one, local authorities? I think we've partly covered that. B, TA providers, and 3, health authorities, please, as part of your advocacy and campaign work. And we'll start with Lucy.
Thank you. Firstly, I echo what the others have all said about the differences across London boroughs, with one slight caveat, which does relate to the health focus and to some extent local authorities of your question. One of the things we've observed through research we've done is that the prevalence of mental health problems amongst people living in TA compared to people experiencing other forms of homelessness, including rough sleeping, is pretty similar. A second point is that the support available to people living in TA is patchy at best, very poor in a lot of cases, non-existent. But we observe that people who've come through a rough sleeping pathway, who've got that experience of sleeping rough in London, tend to have better support in place, particularly in those boroughs in London that have very high numbers of rough sleepers. So they have specialist inclusion health practices, they have increased levels of floating support, for example, compared to people who've come through other routes. So that's something that I think is a slight difference we can observe. Some boroughs are just better positioned to deliver this kind of support. You ask about our experience of dealing with health authorities. This is an area, I think, of real opportunity, actually, as we see the establishment and maturation of the integrated care systems, the ICSs with their integrated care boards, ICBs underneath them. They're at different levels of maturity, I think it's fair to say, but there's a real opportunity around the creation of inclusion health plans. People experiencing homelessness are part of inclusion health groups, which includes other groups of people as well. There is a big difference in, like I say, the provision of specialist healthcare services across different boroughs. But the fact that the ICSs cover a footprint which in most cases covers both inner and outer London boroughs, the way they're divided up, I would hope, lends an opportunity for that intra-borough learning led by the ICSs. And the provision of inclusion health plans, again, I would see as an opportunity if the ICSs indeed consider people living in TA as they do that work. Our experience of working with local authorities on this, I think, and I will defer to others with more experience, but the commissioning system is challenged. We saw some evidence recently from the NCVO showing that charities who provide services on a commission basis, as do Groundswell, are essentially subsidising local authorities. We're operating a lot of our services at a loss. And that's it's indicative, I think, of the system, the problems we're all facing. I don't have experience of working with TA providers, so I'll hand over to others on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Kwajo?
Yes. I think I'll just share with you one example that I had, and that was this year. I won't name the local authority, but I ended up. Someone reached out to me. Someone I knew quite well, actually, or know quite well. Sorry, and they were having issues trying to get their local authority to listen to them and provide them with temporary accommodation because they were effectively homeless and had nowhere to sleep. And what happened was I then had to travel to a different part of London in order to go there with them. And I walked in. I didn't tell them that I was coming. And as soon as I walked into this local authority, there was a stand, and there was two individuals that worked for the council behind that stand. And I went up to them and I asked them, could I speak to someone in your homelessness team, or could I speak to someone in your housing team? To which they responded, the individuals in our homelessness team is currently working from home and have been since the beginning, from the start of the global pandemic. And like I said, this was at the beginning of the year, and the housing team, members of the housing team, were only in on a few days during the week, and the day that I came in, it wasn't the case. But what they did have was two phones on a table in the far corner of the reception area with a directory list and a list of numbers, and they told us to look on that, and there'll be a number on there we can phone. Which we did, and we were there for absolute hours sitting there, and time was ticking by, and I knew that at 5 o'clock everyone will sign off and go home at the end of the day, and the individual I'm with won't know where they're going to be putting their head to sleep at night. So that's when I started to get a bit frustrated. I did start tweeting about it, and a councillor came down, but before that I spoke to the security that were there, and it was getting close to the time where everyone would be signing off, and I said, so what happens when we get to 5 o'clock? They turned around and said they were advised to point people in the direction, or so anyone here that is waiting for a callback, in the direction of the police station to wait for that callback at the end of the day. And for me, that said everything it needed to, because on the one hand, you've got individuals that are homeless, asking to be provided with somewhere to sleep at night. On the other hand, you're being told that they will be pointed in the direction of the police station and hope that they get a call back. And I think that's everything wrong with the way in which we provide temporary accommodation and housing, not just in London, but in this country, because it's not, and there's been several occasions where that has happened, where I've had to show up at local authorities, and it's not until I do that things start changing and things start moving, and actually the individuals I'm with are spoken to like human beings. So as much as it's an issue with funding, I think it's an even bigger issue with attitudes, and especially within local authorities, because often we talk about, when we're talking about temporary accommodation and social housing, housing associations, but it's exactly the same in temporary accommodation. It's attitudes. We are treating individuals that are declaring themselves as homeless. That really needs to change first and foremost. That doesn't cost nothing. It says a lot when, and we've seen it in recent days, where a local authority thinks it's acceptable to destroy tents belonging to homeless people and put them in the back of bin lorries. So you can only imagine how it is that they're treating people that come in to declare themselves homeless, that don't have advocates on their behalf. And it's not all staff members, I think that's fair to say. But even if it's one or two staff members, there's a problem there, and we need to start looking at the culture towards those declaring themselves homeless and what we are actually doing to help them behind the scenes.
Thank you. Maria?
I think that the council, the local authority, are in a hard, difficult position, and the crisis that is at their doorstep every day is a lived reality for our colleagues working within housing at the moment. And Canera is currently working with a council, and the project was about how do we prevent vulnerable people living within the private rented sector, preventing them from becoming homeless, and to try and be an advocate for the tenant, but also have to understand what's going on for the landlords. The challenges with that is because there is so much people that need housing, the local authorities are really always on fight mode. They don't have a chance to sit back and look at how do we think strategically, how do we use the funding that we have, and they need more funding, but how do we use what we have in a preventative way? They are firefighting all the time. And so in that relationship that we're having with the council, we are trying to say, okay, how can we help you to think prevention? There's a lot of grassroots organisations that are doing a lot of preventative work, but as Lucy said, they're subsidising what the council is meant to do and be doing under the prevention. But because the council is really fighting this battle of finding housing and supporting people that have a duty to be housed, to have that strategic preventative strategy and way of thinking is lost in the immediate issues that they're facing. So I would say that is the challenge that the council has, and then you have the people in the middle that are suffering because of the breakdown of structure within housing. I would say about health and housing, I'm on the Future for London Housing and Health Network, and there is a real, there's a growing understanding of the impact of insecure housing on people's health. So in the work that we're doing, we know that 90% of the people that we work with struggle with high anxiety, depression, leading to physical health because of the insecurity of temporary accommodation and the conditions that they're living in. So I think there is a great conversation happening with health and housing, and I think it needs to grow, but also there needs to be more investment, I would say, in ground-roots organisations that are in the position where we can do preventative work and also work at the front line to support our colleagues within the council. So I think there needs to be a work in that, and that's something that I think I'm just been advocating, and I'm sure my colleagues have as well.
And Jamie?
Thank you. I particularly echo what Kwajo was saying. Our advisors and clients and others with lived experience that we speak to report real difficulties in contacting local authorities, simply getting someone on the phone. And we also found we often have to formally challenge a local authority to get a right decision, which takes time and resource, and often expertise. Our clients also tell us that people often get spoken to better if they have an advisor with them, or if an advisor is making the contact, which, first of all, simply doesn't need to be the case. And secondly, it means that we find that people ask us to make quite straightforward contact with the council, that they could, quote unquote, self-serve if they felt like they would get a reasonable hearing. And I think that is a culture issue.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you to all of you. So can I maybe zoom us out a little bit and think about the world, if you like, of temporary accommodation, but the actual physicality of it. So you've got people, like you've said, that come in through a homelessness route, and then you've got, street homelessness or rough sleeping. You've got people that are on the housing waiting list, and they are in their temporary accommodation for however many years, waiting for permanent accommodation. But underlying it, for me anyway, I'm hearing a lot about the stories that you have told have been about standards and about conditions, and I just wonder what suggestions there are around kind of greater advocacy for fixing those standards. We have done some scrutiny here about the private rented sector, but I think we intentionally have left temporary accommodation to one side, although obviously everybody here on this panel knows that TA and private rented sector is basically the same house, isn't it, really? Just a question of who gets it first. And then that point about affordability, I just wonder what kind of changes you would want to see, or you feel like you have seen through either your advocacy or maybe your policy work, Jamie and Lucy, in your case, that your organisations might have done. So perhaps if I start with Lucy, and then we'll go this way this time round.
I might also zoom out a bit and leave the others to talk about the specificity of conditions and the client-facing advocacy.
Yep.
But something that we've been fighting for years and years and years, since Groundswell began in the 90s, is for people who are living this to be properly involved in finding the solutions. And, we see most recent NICE guideline on integrated care for homeless people, very clearly setting out expectations around people with lived experience of homelessness being involved in all aspects, from design and planning, problem specification, through to delivery and evaluation of interventions. And I'd like to see far more of that across London for people living in temporary accommodation, that well-supported, well-resourced opportunities for people to get involved. And when we see, for example, the TAG groups, the Temporary Accommodation Advocacy groups, set up where people who live in the same physical accommodation are supported to get together, we see huge change happening, and not just in terms of relationships with the providers, but for those people, that feeling of being engaged and active and advocating for improvements to your own situation is very important. So I'd say that is a very significant area involving people with lived experience who are living in TA and finding solutions.
Okay. So, but what shape does that take, though? I just wonder, kind of, you're talking about design of service, but what, in practical terms, what does that look like? Because everybody's chasing the same number of properties, and they're not the best at, to be polite. So, unless it's maybe like a new build, I don't know if I'm misunderstanding what you're saying.
So it starts with working with local authorities who are commissioning and delivering not the built accommodation, but are operating the pathways, who are commissioning providers, both support providers, working with landlords, right through from that point at the local authority commissioning level, through to we see borough-wide temporary accommodation groups where people are getting together to advocate en masse, bit of collective work to highlight problems, to suggest solutions that are very hyper-local, hyper-contextualised to their situation, and with that insight that you won't always get from people who are within the system.
Thank you. Kwajo?
Make sure I put that back on. It's a very interesting question. I mean, I have to say, it is really sad that 6.5 years on after Grenfell, we're having to even have this conversation about conditions, and I mean, a few years after the death of Al Bishak, about the conditions and standards of our homes that we are providing people, especially young kids. And I mean, zooming out, it is the issue that is at the forefront of this crisis, I think. Conditions, but also attitudes. Those are the things that need to change as quickly as possible, because ultimately we are, again, putting people's lives at risk in their own homes, and it's meant to be a safe space. And I talk about their lives, not just their physical health, but their mental health as discussed. And I mean, like I mentioned earlier, we are spending so much money on the likes of hotels to put people in temporary accommodation. That will only increase as demand increases. And we know what the state of housing is like around the rest of the country in the private rental sector with Section 21s. We can only expect that demand for temporary accommodation is going to increase. And at what point do we actually go back to the drawing board and think we need to reallocate the money that we're spending? We need to find a more long-term solution, spend this money more effectively, and not just thinking about that, but also within local authorities too. How are we spending this money? Where is this money being allocated to? Could we be spending this money more efficiently? Could we maximise the way in which we are spending it? But I think ultimately the thing that costs nothing is attitude and culture. And if things are really going to change, that's what needs to change first and foremost. It shouldn't have taken Grenfell for lessons to be learned. And I have to say, 6.5 years on, I'm not convinced lessons really have being learnt from what it is that I'm seeing, the way in which residents are spoken to, the way in which the homeless are treated and spoken to at the worst points of their lives. I think any of us can say that. None of us would want to be in those situations. And as Jamie messaged earlier, it's not until there's an advocate there speaking on their behalf that knows what it is that they're talking about, that they actually are treated like human beings. That is a shame. That should not be happening within our local authorities when we're dealing with some of the country's most vulnerable individuals, especially when they are facing homelessness. So those are the things I think that can change. But in regards to temporary accommodation as a whole, yes, I know that local authorities are very much strapped for cash, and the ultimate solution is going to come from central government and funding our local authorities. They've had cuts over the last 13 years which have been absolutely detrimental to what and causing what it is that we're seeing now. So that is the ultimate goal. That's what's really going to change things. But there's things that local authorities can do. I think there's things that the mayor can do to ensure that the way in which people in those desperate situations are treated is changed. I also think that there needs to be higher expectations of those that are providing temporary accommodation. How are we monitoring the conditions that they are letting out to residents? We're handing over X amount of cash, and I know some of these temporary accommodation providers will be absolutely rubbing their hands together because of the amount of people that demand and the demand for temporary accommodation. But are we asking them or setting an expectation for the homes that they are providing, again, some of the city's most vulnerable individuals? If we're not, that is the most immediate change that I think needs to happen. We can't just be handing money over to these organisations to provide temporary accommodation. Yes, we need temporary accommodation, but we need safe, decent temporary accommodation that isn't putting the lives of those living in those homes or those hotel rooms at risk.
Okay, thank you. And do hold that thought about what the mayor and local government can do. I will come back to that. Welcome, Lord Bailey.
Thank you.
I'll complete this section and then hand over at the break. Okay. So, yes, Maria, you're next.
I think there's wider issues that are impacting housing. The need to build more social housing. That's going to take a while. The need to have regulation of rent. The need to raise LHA rates. There's so much things that's impacting where we are in terms of our housing position. And so I think it's important to acknowledge the context that we're in, and that whatever we're talking about today in terms of things that we could do now is impacted by the wider context that we're living in. And whatever we do now, is it sustainable to hold the wider conversation that we need to be having to ensure that we are creating sustainable housing, to ensure that people can afford to pay affordable housing, whatever that looks like. So I think before I look at that question, I just wanted to bring into that room the wider context that we are in at the moment and the impact that it has. In terms of conditions, I think one of the things that's going to be really helpful is to have somebody, if there is a disrepair in a temporary accommodation, for example, the example I gave of the family living in a rat and mice infested property, trying to get somebody and get the landlords and get the local authority to come out took about 6 months. And then we came in and had to push it up to director level. And so if us as an organisation had a challenge trying to find out who is the person that we need to speak to come and look at this situation, much less somebody else that is not in this field having that issue. So I think a direct connection of where somebody can get help and support would be helpful. The other thing is about standards. That the standard that is happening for by what's the organisation? By the setting the standards, they are doing that for studio flats and bed and breakfast. Mm-hmm. Can that standard be grow across all TA provision? You know, is this something, because I think having that standard from another body, it helps the local authority not to take on that conversation, because as I said previously, they're in a bind. They need temporary accommodation, but because a lot of temporary accommodation is now being taken, a lot of landlords are taking back their property, they're in a catch-22 situation. So I think having an organisation to be able to ensure that standards are set and adhered to is going to be really helpful as well.
Thank you. And Jamie.
Thank you. I'd like to start by echoing what Lucy said about the importance of co-production and involving people with lived experience. We have a project specific to the Borough of Westminster, which is funded by Trust for London, looking at experience of people placed in temporary accommodation by that borough. We're also a part of the Westminster Temporary Accommodation Action Group, which is run by Just Life, which also has really good engagement with that local authority, but also both of those are explicitly bringing in the experiences of people with lived experience into that process. As you'd expect, conditions and standards comes up a lot there. A part of that is conditions at the point you move in. What's the property like? Do you have a choice? Do you feel like you have a choice? But also around when an issue develops while you're in that temporary accommodation, what is the process? Do you know who you need to contact to get the repair done? Is the repair done? We've heard stories particularly where temporary accommodation is managed by a private landlord, some reports of landlords who appear to be exploiting the system, so taking money from the council to fix repairs and either doing a poor job or not doing a job at all. So there's an issue about the original conditions of properties that are procured for temporary accommodation, but also around the ongoing maintenance and the resolution of issues that develop during somebody's time in that temporary accommodation, which, as we've all, I think, said, can be years.
Before I move on to my next question, we've heard a lot about and you very eloquently put what the issues are, but it'd be good when we get to the end of this section to think about what proposed solutions you have. But if I can move on. As you all know, the Mayor doesn't have a statutory responsibility for temporary accommodation, but nevertheless we as a panel are interested in what more can be done about addressing the issues in London around temporary accommodation. And so the London Housing Panel set out some recommendations in 2021 that included the need to set up a commission, and some of that also covered using the London model of private rented sector to lobby the government for more powers around temporary accommodation, and to look at opposing permitted development rights conversions, because those are not appropriate. So if there was a London-wide strategy, what would be helpful to set out as its priorities? And I am going to start with Kwajo, Lucy, Jamie and Marie. I'm trying to rotate you, sorry.
I was actually going to say that I think there should be, why we don't have a housing commissioner or a housing commission, I really don't know. I think it's about time we started treating housing as the priority that it is, because we are in this crisis, because we haven't treated it as the priority that it is. I think there should be statutory responsibility, especially for temporary accommodation, because it's at crisis point now.
So for the Mayor of London?
Yes,
okay.
yeah. I also think that, I know we've got what's known as the decent home standard, but it's not really a decent standard at all. I think there absolutely should be something set up that states responsibilities for those providing homes and the expectation that it should be set out to make sure these homes and temporary accommodations that are being provided are fit for human habitation and free from disrepair. I also think that there should be, there was a few things I was thinking of. I think that there needs to be more powers in holding these providers to account when things do go wrong or they are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. There should be expectations set with local authorities across the city, I think, when it comes to standards and culture, that I think should happen as soon as possible, because things really need to change in that sense before we start worrying about all of the sort of other areas to build on. And there was a final thought that I had, but it slipped out of my mind.
Okay, we can come back to that if you do remember it. Thank you. Next, please.
Yes, thank you. It's such an interesting question because, of course, so many of the solutions that we're all calling for are nationally set. I did want to mention that there is huge alignment in our sector between VCSE organisations, individuals like yourself. We all are all calling for the same stuff. So I think we're banging on that drum. Did you want to just finish your point?
Really quickly,
yeah,
because I will forget it again. I just wanted to say, in terms of decisions being made around temporary accommodation and housing, it's imperative that future decisions, when we are making future decisions, the right people are sat around the table, and that includes people currently at the receiving end of any policy or lack of policy. So I'm talking about people in temporary accommodation, people currently struggling, people with lived experience, because I think there's no better way of creating informed policy than having those individuals in the room and around the table too. Otherwise, what's the point? We're hoping that we find solutions, but it's not until we speak to them that we actually make sure that policies are correctly informed.
Okay, thank you.
I'm glad to let you say that, because I agree. One of the interesting things about strategies is the impact, the significant impact they can have on the culture that we've talked about several times, and setting of principles and expectations of how we treat people who are living in temporary accommodation and the standards we expect. I really welcome the leadership the Mayor has shown around rough sleeping, actually, and support for the forthcoming charter to end rough sleeping in London. We've seen some really good work in that area, and if we could map some of that across the temporary accommodation, I think that would be very positive. Some specific things, absolutely, the strategy should set out a very clear expectation for involving people with lived experience in designing the strategy in the first place and its attendant solutions, but also in local design and delivery, right down to that hyper-local level. I echo the point about enforceable standards, both Maria's point earlier about whether there's an organisation that leads on that or it's set out in the strategy itself. Opportunity there, I think, for some work around data and problem profiling. We're here very much representing, our clients and our colleagues who are working in this sector and experiencing it. But there are some real gaps in data. Earlier I mentioned that gap around understanding what PDR converted properties are being used for temporary accommodation in London. So, I think some sort of working group and deeper dive into the world of data and what there is a need for would be very helpful, but a place to start. When we are talking about strategies in particular, I think there's an opportunity again for working very closely with health and health systems, ICSs, and at more local level. And I think a well-designed strategy that sets that expectation could be very helpful, again, in some of that cultural leadership, actually, and that sort of convening power that the Mayor has.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's probably it from me. Let my colleagues step in.
Before I hand over, Lord Bailey would like to come in.
Thank you, and excuse my catastrophic diary mix-up. You spoke earlier on about the Mayor having some statutory responsibility for temporary accommodation. How would that work in view of the fact that it is local councils that have statutory responsibility for housing people?
It's interesting. I think the Mayor perhaps should be allowed to have more involvement, perhaps, when it comes to overall, oversight and decision making, and have oversight of any sort of wider policy decisions. I think that, like I mentioned earlier, the main thing is about standards for me and attitudes, and there should, temporary accommodation for me, I think, should be separate to the rest of social housing because of how big the crisis in that specific area is, and it's only set to continue growing. And as Mayor of London, I think he definitely should have direct involvement in that. How that's, or what the specifics of that looks like, I don't know. But as Mayor of London, and because of how sort of big and immediate the crisis is within temporary accommodation, he absolutely should have involvement and oversight and say over what happens directly with temporary accommodation.
Interesting. And just one small question. You may not be able to answer this, Lucy, but it's just a thing. People often talk about national responses and what the government should be doing, all the rest of that, and the mayor and indeed the GLA can have some stake in that conversation. But the question that the government always asks the mayor, but he often fails to answer, is just how much. So do you have any sort of figure what would be needed to bring temporary accommodation up to any sort of livable level? Is it 10 million a year? Is it 10 billion a year? Is there any sort of ballpark figure?
No, I'm not the person to answer that. However, I'm sure there are. We can go. I would imagine Shelter would probably have that at their fingertips right now. I think for us, a lot of this issue about standards is about regulation rather than purely investment. Some of the national things we talk about are things like the local housing allowance, because these are things that are just making it very difficult for local authorities to source high enough quality provision. And Maria mentioned earlier that just the vast demand means that it's a landlord's market at the moment, really, and people are given what they're given, and local authorities to a great extent have to take what they can get. So I think that other lever of regulation and standards and enforcement could help to rebalance it a little bit without purely that investment. But I'm sure there'll be people with that number at hand who will be queuing up behind me to tell you what it is.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that. I'm keen that we allowed Jamie and Maria to answer that question, and then we'll come to you, Assemblymember Berry. So would you like to go next, Jamie?
Thank you. Yes, I think regarding a sort of London-wide strategy, I think the immediate priorities would be, as others have said, around culture and coordination, particularly actually when it comes to out-of-area placements. So these figures, I think, are from December last year, but at that point, 82% of all out-of-borough placements in England were households that applied to London local authorities. And that the need for that coordination is really stark, particularly when you're talking about people being moved from their support networks, from their healthcare providers, particularly if they have long-term health conditions or disabilities.
Sorry to interrupt you, Jamie. Are you suggesting that number would be lower if there was better coordination?
No, I'm saying that very often there's an issue where people are moved out of area and struggle to continue accessing the health and support that they need, and greater coordination between the sending and receiving. Local authorities could help make that easier. It's never going to be an easy position to be in, to be moved out of borough, of course, but at the moment a lot of people find it's very challenging to maintain maybe regular health appointments, for example, or GP access, or whatever the case may be. And I think the other, I think it was Lucy who mentioned about the convening power. I think the speaking where there are issues that are within national government's control, I think there's a role for the mayor in coordinating a cohesive one voice of London boroughs, because temporary accommodation is a problem across the country, but it is very acute in London at the moment, and I think there's a real role for amplifying that upwards.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll come to you, Maria, and then Assemblymember Berry's got the last two questions in this section.
The housing crisis is not a one-party problem, and I think there is definitely a need for a cross-governmental department that actually looks at the housing crisis and come together and really think about what we need to do to address the emergency that we're in. I think we're beyond crisis.
Can I just interrupt you, just to clarify? So when you say cross-government, do you mean national government, or in the context of London government? And if London, as Lord Bailey was saying, are you suggesting local authority or
I think
mayor
national,
of London level? National, okay.
Yeah. And in terms of the local authority, yes, they do have the power, but it's giving money to a establishment that has a lot of crises that they're dealing with at the moment. So the money comes in and it's absorbed in dealing with what the crisis is right now. And as I said before, the space to think preventative and the space to actually look up and look, how can we resolve this? How can we use our preventative powers? What can we do? They do not have the capacity to do that. So I think there is a need for the mayor to have powers. Now, what does that power look like? We talk power, but what does that mean? And that power needs to be to enable Londoners to carry out what they think they can do to help in terms of a local community level. So you have policy, but how does that work in practice? And who is monitoring how that is working in practice? And I think there needs to be that kind of thinking. Also, on the ground, a clear pathway of where does responsibility lies when somebody comes into the local authority or come into their council and say, I have disrepair and I've been waiting for 6 months, I've been waiting for a year for that damp and the mould and infestation and all of that condensation to be resolved. Now it's impacting my mental health, now it's impacting my health. So a clear pathway of how that is addressed, because at the moment there's none. I think they're the three elements.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Berry.
Thank you very much, Deputy Chair. So we've already slightly asked about solutions. No, it's fine, because the previous questions did lead in that direction. So if it's all right, I just wanted to drill down on a few specific things that have been raised to get a bit more clarity in terms of recommendations. So I want to start with Lucy. You've talked quite a lot and quite well about health and health authorities and the health and safety issues, and the idea that the new ways that the health service is being organised might be an opportunity here, and I hear that really strongly. I've been a local councillor. I just stopped being a local councillor after quite a long time, and I had a case that went on for a very long time, where somebody from my borough was housed in a second borough, and that home was temporary accommodation and was in a dreadful state. And so trying as a councillor from one borough to liaise with the environmental health officers from another borough was really difficult. And that kind of integration or some point of reference would have been so helpful to me in that particular case. And I know there are many different scenarios that you could talk about there. I also know that the environmental health officers themselves have started to warn about how they are picking up the pieces when the housing teams are, I won't say forcing, but people feel absolutely obliged, like Kwajo was saying, when you come in and you've got nowhere to stay that night, to accept whatever's offered, and then a day or so later you realise it has rats, it has mould, and raising it with the environmental health officers instead. So people accepting councils renting properties that are in disrepair already. Again, that's a difficult one, because you're talking about environmental health officers in a different borough than the council that did the renting. So do you have any clarity on I mean, you said that the health authorities are still in the process of maturing. What sort of more specifically would you like to see in terms of organisation there? Because they might have as much trouble as any local councillor might in trying to intervene.
I hesitate a little bit, because one of my answers to this is this is about resource, and this is about resource-starved services. So here's an example of a problem we see a lot: people who are moved from one area to another, who've been on a mental health waiting list for ages, and they move area and they're taken off that list and they go to the bottom of the list in the new area. That is a problem that is at its root caused by the fact there are very long waiting lists. So actually, if the waiting lists weren't that long, we wouldn't be fiddling around trying to make sure that someone could be moved from this position on a waiting list here into another area's waiting list. So that I think is at the bottom of a lot of it. The issue of who is the appropriate person to be supporting with some of these is also interesting. So when you mention environmental health, kind of picking up the pieces, because they're on the ground, they're in the area where the person is currently living, and a problem that shouldn't have occurred in the first place is is now happening, and they're on the. We see the same in health. So we see a lot of people living in temporary accommodation, more commonly using accident and emergency than the rest of the population. And there's a question there about, are they struggling then to access primary healthcare provision in the area that they are currently placed in? So it's an issue. That issue of who in what area is picking up those pieces is one that maps across environmental health to health, I'm sure to lots of other statutory agencies. The out-of-borough issue, we've talked about it a bit, and Jamie's point about handing over isn't necessarily about numbers. That is a problem of supply and demand, but it's about experience. It's about what happens to people once they've moved. Are they able to access good quality support? Well, often not, because their floating support worker or whoever is attached to the local authority that they belong to.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where they go when they've got a repair issue, but it's really difficult.
Exactly. Yeah. And so how we resolve that, I genuinely don't know. One of the things that we do as an advocacy organisation, we deliver homeless health peer advocacy, is that we are working with people in the area that they live. So when we are commissioned by a particular borough, we don't have to support their clients elsewhere. We work in that footprint. And so support provision that can work within a footprint where they're commissioned, but with people who live in that footprint, not who are owned by that local authority, I think is a very useful model. So our health advocates will work with people to help them to access primary healthcare or appropriate healthcare. But it's a really significant one. I'm not sure I've answered your question in its entirety. If there's any follow-up.
So within the health service, are you seeing any moves towards in a more integrated way, working with the various bits of housing within that area? Because obviously the out-of-borough placements may or may not still be within the same health area, but they might be. And if they are they making moves towards doing anything?
The most important thing is the creation of inclusion health plans, and we are seeing some really, really good quality work on that in London and elsewhere. We've been doing a big bit of work with the King's Fund and Pathway, two other health-focused organisations, to support ICSs to write good quality inclusion health plans. We very strongly encourage them to include people living in temporary accommodation in those plans. There is a convening piece. I think historically, having worked in the homelessness sector for a long time, there's been difficulty engaging with health locally, and health has been the partner who's not always at the table. And I do have optimism that the creation of ICSs, and as they bed in, we will see health being more active and even in a leadership role with addressing some of the issues they have within their areas.
Okay, so just because we're a committee that makes recommendations to the Mayor, by and large, at a mayoral level, the Mayor does have a health inequalities remit. He should be checking in and working with the health authorities on their inclusion health plans to make sure that temporary accommodation is considered. Would that be the sort of thing we might say?
Yes, I think that'd be very, very useful. And also encouraging them in his sort of convening powers and soft influencing powers to make sure they are involving people with lived experience, because that's very strongly recommended by NICE. The health authorities are all very well aware of that, but maybe not all doing it to the same degree.
Great, we've heard that loud and clear. Great. So can I move on to the issue that Jamie and Kwajo both raised, which is a very good point, the attitudes, this sort of gatekeeping that you witnessed, Kwajo, when you went in and there was no one available to talk, there was a phone that may or may not call you back. I mean, that is essentially gatekeeping, in the hope that that person might go away and not come replace, find somewhere else to stay. Sorry, that's quite a cynical view, but I think there is an element of that. And the sort of attitudes issue, that is something you've both highlighted is essentially resource light, and something that the Mayor could be involved in. Is that something you'd both suggest we recommend?
Yes, I think so. I think culture is a hard thing to regulate, but yes.
I would say on that, absolutely, there has to be a better standard set, because like you mentioned, it absolutely is gatekeeping, and there's a lot of situations where even those that are homeless and show up to local authorities, because we haven't got enough resources and we don't have enough funding, the criteria is so hard that there are many that are turned away. They just simply don't get access to temporary accommodation, and then if you do, you have to jump through so many hoops just to get there, and spoken down to a lot of the time. So I absolutely do believe that should be a standard set by the mayor and expectations across all local authorities. I just wanted, before I forget, on the subject of health and housing, I absolutely do think, it might be outside of the mayor's remit, but it's also something that I've suggested to the government. There needs to be a tighter unification between housing and health, because there is a direct correlation between the two, and I think any decisions made or big decisions made by the government in regards to housing should always take into consideration the impact on residents' health. I mean, the facts and statistics are there. The fact that NHS last year spent £1.4 billion looking after people living in poor conditions. The fact that NHS spent £34 million looking after people living in homes with damp and mould is an absolute clear example of why there needs to be a tighter relationship between health and housing, especially when it's impacting the lives of so many kids. There's loads of situations where medical professionals, I've seen it myself, medical professionals, head teachers, educational professionals have written into housing or providers of housing, temporary accommodation, local authorities on behalf of families, kids, individuals, and these professionals are often lucky if they even get a response to their concerns. That should not be the case. There should be a higher expectation, and an expectation that housing, local authorities and housing professionals should be listening to concerns being raised by medical professionals and educational professionals too, because it simply isn't good enough and continues to put the lives of not just adults but kids at risk too.
Thank you very much. That certainly tallies with my experience as well. So the other thing I wanted to raise, and it sort of relates to the lack of data, I think, that Lucy's talked about as well. But it's also, I think, potentially an outcome of all the difficulties in getting help, the difficulties in having your voice heard, is in terms of outcomes from the perspective of people in minorities, whether that is disabled people or people of colour or anyone else who might not be listened to because of their identity. Do you have any data to suggest that there are unequal outcomes in this respect? Because again, that comes under the mayor's remit. I've been looking into this. I suspect the answer is no, but if you did have any data or any sign anywhere we might look for data on these kinds of outcomes in terms of gaining access to temporary accommodation or in terms of improving the quality of it. I'm looking at Jamie because he's very keen to speak, I think. I've
got my finger on the button, but unfortunately I am going to say no. Okay. I'm afraid, Sian.
I thought the answer might be no. I mean, I really have tried to find the data myself. Yeah.
Absolutely. One thing I'd add is there are absolutely intersectionalities here, and you're right to mention disability and race. But I'd also say that the underlying commonality among people in temporary accommodation is poverty, and that is itself a feature that often means that people are not listened to. So I think you'd find that underlying the whole piece. But I'm very interested if anyone does have any data.
It's still on. I was going to say, I'm sure in the back of my mind there was some data in regards to temporary accommodation and kids from minority backgrounds. I can see if I can try and find that data, but a situational scenario is there's a school in South London where there's around 300 kids that attend there currently, and half of them are homeless. And that's a mixture of temporary accommodation, but half of them are homeless. So I think that in itself shows the scale of the issue. Perhaps we do need to look for more data or creating more data to support that, but there's situations like that happening across the city and across the country too.
Sorry, Sam, can I just quickly jump in and just quickly ask Lucy?
I've got one more aspect of my follow-ups to do, but just so as I can
go. I'll go
come back
it's
to
fine.
it.
It's fine.
Okay.
You go.
So, in fact, sorry, there's two, is that right? One's very quick. Lucy, you mentioned, I thought that was really interesting, that in terms of the homelessness services, you're more likely to get health support alongside help getting a roof over your head. And as I understand it, the mayor's team do support the homelessness services across London. There is some funding and support that goes out to those homelessness charities and providers to allow for that to happen. Is that something you would recommend that also happens in the case of people in temporary accommodation?
Ultimately, what it boils down for me is it ought to be person-centred. There are so many people in temporary accommodation and they are not all the same and do not all have the same needs. People who come through the rough sleeping route very often will have, dreadful phrase, complex needs. There'll be these multiple disadvantages and often very significant problems that have arisen during that period of rough sleeping, often very significant barriers to engaging. So the services that are provided, the specialist services, often do a great deal of in-reach or outreach. They're very, very hyper-flexible in their approach and psychologically informed. Now, I'm a big fan of saying if you make a service good for the people with the greatest need, then it works better for everybody. But there is a limit to how flexible all services can be for everybody living in TA. I think my point in recognising that disparity is that for the vast majority of people living in TA, there is no additional support. The support that is provided is inconsistent or very, very light touch, and it isn't doing the job that's needed. It's not person-centred, it's not flexible, it's not tailored. The nature of rough sleeping services is they do tend to at least aspire to that. So I'd like to see a greater degree of psychologically informed services, trauma-informed services, person-centred work within that whole sector. And again, the support services that are offering floating support to people to be better resourced so workers have lower caseloads and can actually get round the people that they are supporting.
Great, okay, thank you. And then, so I'm trying to get through this as quickly as possible. You also, Lucy, mentioned that sometimes people are moved out at very, very short notice. What's behind that? Because surely the landlord who wants to reclaim their home needs to give more notice than that to the local authority. Is there a lack of communication going on there?
I genuinely don't know. That comes from Shelter's work that they published earlier this year, Still Living in Limbo, that they surveyed a large number, more than 1,000 households living in temporary accommodation, and a very high number of those had less than 48 hours notice when they moved from their last placement to their current one. Now, I can't tell you what the reason was for all of those moves, but it's certainly worth drilling into, I think.
I wonder, Maria, if you have any insight into that. In the terms of the terms on which local authorities are getting these homes from landlords, the landlords can't be able to give them such short notice at the authority level, can they?
I think what Lucy's saying, there are multiple reasons, and I think that needs to be investigated more. We do know that a lot of landlords are taking back their properties because they want to sell, or they want to move back into their properties. In terms of the contract and arrangements between the landlords and the council, that's something to look into. We know that Section 21 doesn't help, and so I think it's happening at a fast rate, and there needs to be an investigation of why and how is that being able to happen.
Okay, we can ask further questions as part of our work. Yeah. Kwajo, you might have something to say.
I just wanted to, in terms of that and in terms of evictions too, I think there needs to be a conversation around local authorities' expectations also, because in many cases you're told, and I've heard it many times, that if a landlord is evicting you and you're going to need support because there's nowhere else you can go from the local authority, you're almost told, or there's been cases where they've been told to wait and hold on as long as possible to be evicted, or to have the bailiffs come and knock on your door and turf you out on the street and then show up to the council because of this idea of making yourself intentionally homeless. And if you decide to then leave early, you are in fact making yourself intentionally homeless. You have to wait until you're at the absolutely worst point and worst situation when you've got a bailiff kicking you out onto the street before you show up at the council in order to get access to their support, which shouldn't be the case. Because why are we telling people that it's not until you it's not just the fact that you're going to be made homeless, but the fact you have to embarrassingly wait for bailiffs to knock on your door and turf you out onto the streets and then change the lock before you can take and drag all of your belongings down to the local authority and beg them for help and hope that someone and their good nature will turn around and provide that support. Shouldn't be the case, and the conversation should be happening around that and our expectations.
Yeah, no, I mean, theoretically, people have 54 days. They can go to the council when they know it's going to be in 54 days, and that new duty doesn't seem to really kick in until people are literally on the street. No,
you're literally told you're making yourself intentionally homeless, and by that point, they don't require to help you, as opposed to if you're showing up after being kicked out and you're given a letter saying you are homeless.
Okay.
On that, very quickly, just to finish off that point, I suspect this is not all about landlords taking back properties, but this is also about local authorities having access to a more appropriate property or needing a property back for some reason to give to somebody else. And I suspect there's a bit of churn going on where people are moving between temporary accommodation placements, not because they've got a permanent home and not because the landlord's removed it, but for some reason the local authority has for needing to move people between placements.
Okay, I think we are going to have to ask some more questions about that.
We will do. Before I say thank you to our guests for their great contribution, one little thing, Lucy. If you listen to everybody speak, we can all agree there's a crisis. I think emergency is where we're at. We're beyond crisis. I think we could all agree with that. But you talked about health teams and some of the work they're doing, their change, and it seems to me that some of this is going to need big structural change. But the advantage, it would seem, that the health team has is that they have a national history, don't they? They are a national organisation. Much of their conversations talk about how they do things nationally. Do you feel that we, when dealing with temporary accommodation, need to get beyond the local authority silo, the London-based silo?
Tough one. I'm not sure health has always benefited all that much from that, because health systems can be extremely siloed, and the sort of the old commissioning groups and now the ICSs still have that to a degree, I think. So not perfect over there.
But they have national systems, don't they? They have the form to apply for a thing looks the same here as it does in West London or East London, whereas local authorities have very different approaches because of their local areas.
Yeah, it's the age-old question of how locally contextualised you want to be. When I talk to local authorities around the country, there's a bit of a sense that they're all a unique snowflake and they're all very, very different and want to understand what's going on in their area. And that goes right down to neighbourhood level. You know, you will have a uniqueness to each area, and you need to be listening to what matters in that area, and having that flexibility, I think, is very valuable. At a national level, some of these things, like how you regulate standards, again, it's a debate, really, isn't it? And it's whether your principles say that centralised control leads to consistency, which people so badly need, or whether you hamstring local areas' ability to respond to very specific local needs. So I think there's a values judgment in that. I am a fan of listening to people who are living in those situations, and they will have very, very localised, contextualised concerns. But undoubtedly there are national levers that can be pulled here. But I think we've certainly mentioned things to do with things like local housing allowance and those bigger policy levers rather than standardisation.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of this section. I'd like to thank all our guests for your contribution today. We're about to take a 5-minute recess, so we can adjournment is the word I'm looking for. A 5-minute adjournment so we can swap over to our next set of guests. Thank you very much for your contributions. Much appreciated. Good afternoon and welcome back to the second half of our Housing Committee meeting this afternoon. I'd like to say welcome to our second panel of guests, which is made up of Kate Webb, who is Head of Housing Strategy, Housing and Land, GLA, Dinah Roake, Chair of London Housing Panel, Joanna Drew, Director of Housing and Regeneration, London Borough of Enfield and Co-Chair of the London Housing Directors Group, Josie Parsons, Chief Executive Officer, Local Spare Space, and Sue Edmonds, Chief Executive, Capital Letters. Have I butchered anyone's name? Well, that's a first for me. Good, good afternoon. As is our tradition is that I, as a chair, would normally kick off the first question, but because of circumstances of earlier on, we're going to go straight to Assembly Member. Baker, sorry, Assembly Member Baker. My good day continues.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, panel, and thanks everyone for being here. So I want to kick off with, obviously, I think some of you have already heard the panel we had this not this morning, just now, talking about some of the issues in the really difficult state of temporary accommodation in London. And some of you, so Joanne, Kate and Dinah, your organisations wrote to Michael Gove about temporary accommodation recently, and the letter states that you're working together in a whole London effort to tackle some of the issues around temporary accommodation. Bearing in mind that we've already talked about how difficult that is, can you talk about what that partnership looks like and what you have managed to achieve? Shall I ask Kate? Shall I come to you first? Is that okay? Or do you want no? That's you'll need to turn the mic on.
It's been very much led by the London Housing Panel.
Absolutely fine. Dinah, if you'd like to kick off, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Well, I think what's been achieved is getting to the letter. I mean, it all started before my time with the London Housing Panel, but in the Mayor using his convening powers to pull together the group to have that conversation in a pan-London way. And I think it has achieved that cross-sector involvement through everybody identifying common ground and wanting to be supportive and working together. The letter you've had, I'm conscious of time, so I don't think I need necessarily to go into the detail of it unless you want me to. But the detail of the letter was submitted to you as evidence for the panel, for the meeting, but it is very much about pulling together to find solutions, both what we can do at a local level, what we can do at a London-wide level, and with the community and voluntary sectors involved as well. And you heard Maria, who's one of the London Housing Panel members. Earlier. Yeah,
I think you're right. I don't think we need to know the full detail or anything like that. But is there anything that you'd like to pull out in terms of what you are able to do when pulled together? Is there anything that?
I think one of the things that is about to happen, I'm just a bit concerned in terms of some of the finalising of some of the funding, but I think I can talk about a project that we're the next step, having produced the letter that was submitted to Michael Gove, establishing what we believe to be the problems and some of the solutions, is a focus on something that we're calling encounters and conversations, where we would be looking and picking up, I think, some of the points that were made in the earlier panel about attitudes and gatekeeping, and actually carrying out that project with community and voluntary sector members in a supported conversation, because some of these conversations can be very traumatic, but actually doing that in a way that we can produce some good practice that hopefully can then be shared across London for how when somebody arrives saying that they've got an issue, how that's actually then addressed.
That's really
helpful. That's one future example.
That's fantastic. Before I go on to talk about what else needs to be done, Kate and Joanne, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think the point about the common ground is key. I think we heard in the previous session that local authorities are in an extremely difficult position we shouldn't lose sight of how that translates to people on the ground who are trying to access support from them and the very, very harsh outcomes that they're feeling. And I think the value of the partnership that we've developed is that we are able to work collaboratively with kind of both sides of the table, if you will, the boroughs, the mayor, and the community and voluntary sector organisations, trying to come together and find that common ground. And as Dinah says, the GLA is very happy to be funding this new piece of qualitative research, which will begin to get into those really difficult culture conversations about how do we improve the lived experiences and the feelings of kind of respect and validation that people need as they navigate what is always going to be an extremely fraught process.
Thanks, that's really helpful.
Yeah, just from a local authority perspective, I think we in London Councils were very pleased to support the collaborative effort, because whilst we battle to deliver on our statutory responsibilities at this really challenging time, we've never needed the support and the input of the community and voluntary sector, because they can reach out into communities and support people in ways that perhaps institutions like local authorities can't. So we really value the contribution and would like to see, as an outcome of this very difficult time, the strengthening of that sector so that it really can provide additional safety net support around the most vulnerable people we're working with.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And now I'm going to pull all the way back to, again, we've been hearing all of the significant problems that from our grassroots and voluntary sector just now, but it would be really good to hear from you all, everyone on the panel, what you feel the key changes are that need to happen at a London level to address the crisis in temporary accommodation. Maybe I can come to Josie or Sue and then come back to the other. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so we speak about housing emergency, don't we? Housing crisis. If this is a housing emergency, more than a crisis, then it needs an emergency response. And my challenge really for the mayor is to ask him if he could lobby for taking housing out of the political arena and treating it as a truly national crisis that needs a national crisis response. So making sure that it has a long-term strategy that is not part of the political football that goes with a 5-year cycle in politics, with policies being withdrawn and money being given and withdrawn and changes being made in that are just impossible to navigate and to really deliver any kind of a long-term solution. So that's my challenge.
Yes, no, absolutely, totally understand. Sue.
Thank you. So just briefly, Capital Letters is also a pan-London collaborative organisation. Yeah. We've recently consolidated down to 10 members just because of the size of the issue that we're facing in terms of finding homes. So I think the real issue is supply versus demand. So in our submission we said how many properties were available back in June. We ran our numbers again. Sort of, if I can find my numbers, 19,800 properties available in London listed for rent on the 30th of October. There were 17 that were offered at LHA rents. And we know also that for every property that's listed, it won't go at the rent that it's listed for. There's at least 30 people vying for that property. We have an absolutely big issue of supply. So it's about how do we find solutions to that. And I'd also like to posit the question back, what is the purpose of temporary accommodation? We've already heard people are there for 5, 10, 15 years, longer, particularly in London. It should be temporary. 8 to 12 weeks to do an assessment and then enable people to move on to appropriate accommodation. We haven't got the appropriate accommodation currently, so all the temporary accommodation is silted up with conflicting demands through asylum seekers and other conflicting policies. So again, going back on the housing policy issue, can we have a cross-departmental approach to housing as well as a pure housing approach? And we need to find intermediate solutions to the problem whilst we think about long-term solutions. Because if we carry on doing what we're doing, we will continue to have an ever-worsening issue. I know our members are paying huge amounts of money in temporary accommodation every month. I think London Council say it's something like £60 million a month at the moment. And picking up on the issue that was mentioned earlier about people being given 48 hours notice for moving, I think that's hotel and B&B accommodation. And I know some of our members who've not had to use B&B accommodation are now having to do so. And they'd like us to work, possibly with the Mayor, to find some better, proper temporary solutions, maybe with professional assessment, so we can move people through the process more quickly, but we need supply for them to move into. And I'd like to focus on the supply solution with a qualification of what we think temporary accommodation is and should be.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because for me it sounds like now temporary accommodation refers to the fact that it's temporary for those individuals, but not actually, doesn't really describe the reasons that they ended up there.
Indeed.
It's not necessarily an emergency situation. A lot of the times now it's simply just a failure of our housing system. Is that fair to say?
So Section 21 continues to be the major cause of homelessness.
Yeah.
I'm also aware, because we represent landlords as well as tenants in our member boroughs, so we know landlords are similarly being affected by the cost of living crisis and increasing mortgage price increases. So some of them can't make it work anymore, so they may well be selling their property or withdrawing it from the LHA area because they need to generate more income to cover their costs. So I wouldn't want to suggest that landlords are the problem either. We have a systemic issue that needs big solutions. It is a crisis, and we can't just carry on doing the little bits that we're doing. So social housing is what we need, but we need more housing of all kinds, because for a properly functioning housing market, you need homes at every price point. You need a vibrant PRS, because that can be more affordable, but also encourages social mobility, enables people to move more readily to go to different areas for work and things like that. But house builders are not building. You know, they are also being hit by increasing costs, people not buying properties, so they're all slowing down. The housing associations are slowing down their building programmes as well, because they're rightly focusing on the quality of their accommodation and winding back on their development programmes. The sum total is we're not building enough homes, and last year more homes were either sold or demolished in the social housing sector than were built. We've got 1.2 million people on waiting lists across the country. 300,000 of those are in London, and they're increasing. And a lot of those people are in temporary accommodation waiting for suitable homes. We don't have them. We have to find a solution to that problem.
Thank you, Sue. Thanks very much. Joanne, could I come to you? So the question is, what are the key changes in London that we need?
So I think in terms of the private rented sector, which we rely on heavily in order to meet the needs of vulnerable low-income households and to address our statutory homelessness responsibilities. I think we have to recognise that over the last 2 decades we've seen that sector grow and become ever more buoyant. So from about roughly 10% of a housing market, it's now around 30%, different proportions in different boroughs, but just roughly. What I think we're now seeing is the start of a retrenchment back to a lower level of private rented sector accommodation. We don't know exactly, as one of the contributors earlier said, but what we do know, for example, is in 2022, 40% of the new listings for sales came from private landlords who had previously rented their property. Now, we don't know whether they go back into the rental market following sale. I suspect not, because the level of buy-to-let mortgages has reduced in the period, so suspect that's not the case. So I think one of the things that we need to do, and which the Mayor has already supported, but it needs to be expanded, is a buyback scheme. Councils and charities need to intervene to buy those homes back to keep them available for lower income households. And so it will be a different type of private rented sector that we're creating, but with more intervention from public and charitable organisations to make those homes still available for lower income households. So I think a close look about how we can address the challenges in the private rented sector so that we provide housing for all within the homes that we already have. Obviously building new homes is absolutely critical, but that will be an important thing to look at for London.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Joanne. Dinah.
I think I'm going to echo that point.
That's
and
fine.
You'll know from the London Housing Panel's
Yes.
Priorities that massively increasing social housing, social rented housing supply is one of our key priorities. And I think that social housing supply is key to unlocking a lot of the problems that we've been talking about today, because it addresses the need for those homes to be at a level that people can afford to pay their rent, and that picks up a lot of the problems that were discussed in terms of health and well-being as well, in terms of if people can afford to pay their rent, in terms of, and they're settled. We have been doing a little bit of work with the public health team at the GLA, and identifying, although it's very difficult to attribute and quantify on an individual basis, there is very, very clear evidence from a piece of research that was done last year in terms of the benefits across the piece. So it's not actually necessarily about additional, well, there is additional capital funding required to make this happen, but I agree completely with the point about reorientating the ownership of our existing stock, because from the panel's point of view, it's very much about the net housing supply being available to people on lower incomes and the proportion of people on lower incomes in London that need them.
Yeah, because if the PRS is reducing to a certain extent at the moment, then we either make an intervention to try and to fill that gap, or it happens without us, and who knows what well, it sounds like no one quite knows what's happening at the moment. But
and I think the cost as well at the moment, the cost currently in terms of construction costs, new construction costs, are getting to a point where, pretty much at a point where buying an existing property is as cheap as building a new one.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of other issues in terms of the wider market housing system, but in terms of the need, in terms of people with lower incomes, I mean, that seems to be the best way to go.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Dinah. Can I go to Kate and then come back to you, Sue? Cheers.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with a lot of what's been said. I think fundamentally what we're seeing is the consequences of an affordability crisis. And unsurprisingly, that affordability is very much driven by what we're seeing on the supply side. So we would 100% echo what the panellists have said around the need for new social rent supply. I'm sure Assembly members are incredibly bored of hearing people from the GLA say that we consistently don't get the level of funding we need from government to enable us to actually build at the level London needs. We commissioned Savills to do some analysis for us, looking at what the London plan says is needed in terms of affordable housing, looking at where the current market is in terms of capacity, building costs, etc. And that identified that you need 4.9 billion a year to build at levels of need. We don't get anything close to that. So we are always going to be unashamedly asking government to help us to support people more. I would agree with everyone that acquisitions can play a really interesting role at the moment. The situation for housing developers is very complex at the moment. It's very challenging. The Deputy Mayor brought together a number of players, including many people on the panel, but from the public and private sector over the summer, to try and understand what are those constraints to delivery at the moment. And one of the very clear recommendations from that grouping was that actually in the current context, with high construction costs, borrowing costs high, there is a real value in an acquisitions programme that can provide that sort of emergency response, an emergency injection of new supply. It's something that, as the committee knows, we did through the last AHP, through the Right to Buy Back programme. And we have said publicly over the last couple of weeks that we are going to be looking to launch a new acquisition programme. We'll be doing that very, very shortly. And certainly we want to continue learning those lessons that we learned through the first Right to Buy Back programme, that TA is really valuable to local authorities, and ensuring that we're able to support that is something that we want to maintain. I think I would note that there's an inherent trade-off with acquisitions. We know that London needs more homes of all types. So there is a difficult trade-off of, are you putting grant funding into acquisitions, or are you putting it into genuinely new supply? But I think in the current context, particularly when you're looking at those landlord dynamics, there is a need to support local authorities to acquire what stock they can. I also think that we do need to look at the private rented sector. It is very welcome that the Renters Reform Bill is finally progressing. Section 21 is still a big trigger of homelessness, and fear of it, both on the local authority side and on the household side, is always going to be an impediment to using the PRS to resolve homelessness and to get people out of TA. So moving towards a more secure private rented sector, hugely welcomed, although I think we do have concerns, as I know many others share, that the government has signalled a potential sort of perpetual delay there with the suggestion that new powers won't actually come into force until the court system is equipped to deal with the change in behaviour. I think the big elephant in the room is the local housing allowance and the level of support we're prepared to put in to support people. You know, in London, many people on salaries, on good salaries, still need local housing allowance to afford private rents. We are not going to be able to make full use of the PRS unless the government increases LHA rates to at least the 30th percentile. That is expensive. We can't shy away from it, and it's why I sort of slightly disagree that we can never aspire to take housing out of politics, because when you're talking about spending sort of £2 billion, that is an inherently political question. But the failure to do it will be the continued persistence of very high levels of temporary accommodation, which we're now seeing extend outside of London as well, to councils in places who have never normally had this level of problem and are now having their minds concentrated in a way which is, you know, all too familiar for Joanne and her colleagues.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Sue, did you want to just come back in?
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up this point about how do we repurpose existing supply whilst we wait for new supply to be delivered, because obviously we do need new supply. And the LGA reported yesterday there's something like 1 million homes nationally that are empty at the moment. And I did some research back in 2022 and I reckon there were about 88,000 empty homes in London at the time. So maybe there's something that the Mayor could do to create an empty homes strategy to support boroughs to find these homes, you know, get them registered, perhaps with some resources. I also know colleagues in our member boroughs struggle with the resources to go out and find them, and then the owners of the properties might need some incentives to bring them back, but maybe they could be used for PRS or homeless households, for instance, as part of the deal if they got some money or a loan or something. So that would be another contribution. This is about a blended approach with different solutions to help in the immediate short term, which is probably going to, short term is probably 5 to 10 years. We need to find some interim solutions. And picking up the point about LHA, I absolutely completely agree about LHA. However, if you increase LHA rates without commensurate increases in the benefit cap, you'll put more people at risk of homelessness. And the problem with that is certainly Treasury is not going to agree to increase benefits currently, and so we go back to that situation where the W do, the W don't. We do need to increase LHA rates. I think that will entice some landlords to come back to the market, so it might increase opportunities. And certainly about 50% of people in temporary accommodation or are homeless are working. So it isn't that they're all not working, but they can't afford rents in London.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I've just suddenly been made aware that I'm massively running over time. So, Josie, I know you wanted to come in. Are you able to do that briefly? I do apologise because I know you haven't said much.
I just wanted to outline Local Spaces model. So Local Space is a registered provider of social housing that works in partnership with a number of local authorities to provide them with a more cost-effective alternative to some of the really short-term solutions for temporary accommodation, so nightly let and hotel accommodation. We provide a more settled alternative that costs quite a lot less, at least 20% less. Often a great deal more than that less. Our model is purchase and repair. So we are one of the people out there buying back homes that are put up for sale by buy-to-let landlords who are moving out of the market. And we will take on properties that maybe a new entrant to the buy-to-let landlord market might not, a property that needs money spending on it. So our average spend on our refurbishment programme is £40,000 plus VAT. That's quite normal. We would spend that, whereas a new buy-to-let landlord might not want to spend that kind of money. And what we do with that money is make sure that the home that we provide for nominations from our local authority partners from their homeless register, not their housing register, is in a really good state. So it's technically temporary accommodation in the sense that it's not a permanent home, it's not a secure tenancy, but our average tenure length is 6 years, so it's not temporary in any normal definition of the word, and it certainly isn't a low quality, really unpleasant temporary accommodation that some people have to suffer to live in.
Thanks very much. Okay.
Sorry,
Thanks,
can I just
Chair.
quick question? At what scale? How many properties do you have?
We've got just less than 3,000 properties at the moment.
Okay, and this works financially as a business?
It works to a degree. In some local authorities, we are able to benefit from some right to buy funding to assist us, and that helps the money to go a bit further.
Okay.
In other local authorities, we don't get that kind of funding. We have been able to access some GLA grant in some circumstances, but there are some limitations around the availability of GLA grant for this type of funding because of the space standards. And if you're buying back existing properties, they won't have been constructed with the space standards in mind, so that can be a barrier.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Berry.
Thank you very much. So my question goes back to some of these questions around competing priorities, and I'll start with Dinah and go down, and then I've got a question for Kate at the end. So in response to our call for evidence, Crisis responded to us and said that it had serious concerns about any initiative that seeks to increase the provision of any form of temporary accommodation without addressing the scope to improve access to settled housing. It says to do so risks perpetuating the harms that even good quality temporary accommodation causes to individuals, as well as the wider cost to public services. And I think that is a really good question. There are some interventions we can make to increase the amount of temporary accommodation that might actually get in the way of providing more settled accommodation. So I wanted to ask about how we resolve this, and in terms of your work, I think, Dinah, you said, you know, you've been having discussions about buying things back and acquiring homes that have been in the private rented sector, might have been used as temporary accommodation, and making them truly long-term and affordable. Do you want to talk a bit about that? Have you had any sort of pushback from people who would rather have it for temporary accommodation, for example? Microphone, sorry.
That particular initiative is sort of slightly separate from the London Housing Panel, but it very much about settled accommodation, but it's about settled accommodation for an individual household who would otherwise be made homeless from their home. So it's a bit more complicated. There hasn't been any pushback, but then the work probably hasn't developed sufficiently. So it's more similar to Josie's proposition, but very much looking at the settled home position. And the only pushback that has been flagged would be a local authorities issue if there were the sense that somebody was somehow jumping the waiting list. So I think from the panel's point of view, definitely the focus needs to be on that long-term supply of social rented homes, because as one of the speakers in the first panel was saying, very much that bottleneck. If there was an easy flow through and there were homes for people to be moved to, settled once their assessment had happened, there would be much less likely for people to be spending time over the long period of time in temporary accommodation. And I think one of the things that we've heard in the panel from some of the panel members supporting people like Maria, obviously, is that when we say when Shelter says somebody's been in temporary accommodation for 10, 15, 20 years, that they've not been in the same home for the whole of that time. I mean, I think that you kind of think, oh, they've been settled for 20 years. Well, no, they haven't. They've been at risk of moving every 12 months or whatever, with the notice periods that were talked about earlier. So I just wanted to, I'm sure everybody is aware of that, but it is something that when you hear that length of time, it sounds as though somebody's settled, but it definitely isn't. So I think I've not quite answered your question totally, have I? But because the work hasn't progressed far enough to really be able to tell you whether there's any sort of fundamental problems with it, but it is focused very much on that settled accommodation, not providing temporary.
I'll come to you at the end, Kate, if that's all right. Joanne, you, as a local authority, you must battle with this. You've got, capital investment versus revenue that you have to pay out every week. You're trying to balance that off and make the right long-term decisions.
I mean, as a local authority, it's in our DNA. We don't want to have temporary accommodation. We don't want to have that need. So we want permanent, stable homes for our residents. Sorry.
Can you point the microphone more at your face? Yeah.
So I would agree with the sentiments of the crisis research, but what I would say is we're in an unprecedented crisis situation, which started over a year ago now. So we've now got people living in hotels, substantial numbers. So London Councils collects data from all boroughs, and we will be able to submit our September Q3 data, which might be helpful. But in June, we had 986 families, households in B&B for over 6 weeks. So we were in breach of our statutory duty. In Enfield, 140 of those households were ours. So there is no question that we have to provide very urgently alternative fit for purpose temporary accommodation. Now, that's not our long-term aspiration. We don't want to have that in 5 years' time as temporary accommodation. We want to be able to flip it into rented accommodation. But absolutely now the crisis is such we must provide more temporary accommodation, because hotel provision is neither affordable nor acceptable for families.
Okay, thank you very much. Josie, I don't know if you have more to add. You outlined your model quite well, and your model you'd argue would ought to expand to take up some more people from the B&Bs?
Even if it's not local space expanding, using the model in other locations, absolutely. The core and how local space came into being was the grant of a small portfolio of property that we were able to use as a seed fund, if you like. So grant in the form of property rather than in the form of money to assist in our generation in the first instance in 2006. The competing priorities piece and the description from Crisis of their concerns about expanding temporary accommodation, I totally understand why they say that. I would love to be living in a world where local space and its model was not necessary. However, we live in the UK in 2023 in a crisis scenario where absolutely every alternative, every possible solution is part of the solution. There is no one silver bullet. We need all of these things to be in place and mesh together properly so that we have a longer term aspiration to have everybody in appropriate long-term accommodation. I would love to be able to convert my assured short-hold tenancies into secure tenancies because there was no longer a need for them. That's not the reality though, and we do have to live in the reality that we are in and deal with the problem that's in front of us, rather than aspiring to deal with a problem that we actually can't solve quickly. We can't solve the long-term delivery, the long-term supply quickly. I wish we could, but we can't.
Thank you. And Sue?
Thank you. I agree with Crisis sentiments, but as others have said, it's about the reality of what we're living at the moment, and it is about coming up with alternative solutions. There's something around how do we make the PRS more attractive to landlords to come back to the market, and maybe there's something the Mayor could be doing to persuade government to think about different fiscal changes, because some of that is what's driven landlords out of the market, because it's punitive on them. But maybe loans and grants enable them to bring the properties up to good quality standards, maybe in return for local authorities being able to use them for a period of time for homeless households. But one of the things we learned from Capital Letters is, whilst we've predominantly been procuring PRS properties so our members can discharge responsibilities, we've offered a tenancy sustainment service both for our tenants and our landlords, because that can be quite fundamentally life-changing in terms of avoiding the revolving door of homelessness. We always have 2-year ASTs with an aspiration for that they would be renewed, so we work with the landlords, but we are there to ensure that if there are some problems with the tenancy, arrears, damage, etc., we are there to help and give confidence to landlords. We have an insurance product that protects landlords against arrears and property damage in the future. LHA increases, as I've said already, would be attractive to them. And there are landlords genuinely who want to do something good with their property, depending on where they've come from. I think another thing to think about is how do we engage patient investors, you know, pension funds and the like, in investing in London, in buying properties now and perhaps new build in the longer term. We're in discussions with a company at the moment about a pan-London initiative which could deliver 5,000 homes over the next 5 years, which starts with buying properties and doing them up. So they have to do them up to our standards, and they're the standards we've agreed with our members. And then we'd offer them to our members. So it'd be an individual agreement with our individual boroughs about what they have. But there's maybe something the mayor could consider about giving guarantees for those sorts of schemes as well, so that these properties are available for London then. So there are people out there who have money. Yes, they want to make some money out of it, so clearly there's an interest rate increase, but we're negotiating a fixed 3.5% increase, so that's no CPI increases. LHA tenants in the properties wouldn't have a rent increase. We'd have to generate income to cover the increases. But it's not beyond the bounds of possibility to make that work, and that is one of the solutions we think is a viable option.
Okay, that's really interesting. Can I ask, I mean, you must have experience of some of your landlords that you've been working with, who then turn around and say, I would like to exit the landlord business, thank you. And are you doing anything to point them towards boroughs who are using the Right to Buy Back fund? Are you trying to keep those landlords, you know, keep those homes within the sector that way, even if it involves buying it off the landlord?
They don't always tell us. In fact, they seldom tell us if they're planning to sell. You find out after the fact. So the tenancy might come to an end naturally. Our job, you know, so a quarter before the tenancy is due to end, we're contacting the landlord saying, you are going to renew anyway, aren't you? You've got a tenant who's paying the rent. It's cheaper to keep them in the property than, you know, change. But if they choose to end the tenancy naturally, so it's not a Section 21 situation, we don't know necessarily. They don't tell us if they don't want to. So, but we can certainly think about how we do that better.
I would have thought so. Yes. I was hoping to find an example of where you'd done that and then maybe kept the tenant in place while the thing was transferred. But I don't know if that's just wishful thinking.
Yeah, we have done different things whereby a tenant has been placed in a property that maybe subsequently has been found they can't afford to pay the rent any longer. So we work with both the landlord and the local authority to find a different accommodation for them so they don't get homeless again.
No, I was thinking more of the right to buy back fund and what it might be used for.
We are working with one of our member boroughs to provide the housing management service for their right to buy back scheme, so we will certainly talk to them about. We're not aware of every borough currently that is doing a right to buy back scheme, so it'd be helpful to know that, and then we can certainly map what properties we've got and to see if we can make that work.
I'm sure Kate could provide you with that information.
Yes. But I'll take that away as something for us to look at.
Assembly member, we're a little bit pressed for time.
Oh, I do really need to ask Kate something about the thing you said earlier, which was that you are working towards looking to launch a new acquisitions programme, because I'm a big fan of Right to Buy Back. I think buying the supply is a good way to be, in the short term, increasing the supply of social housing, and we should be getting more money from government to do it, but the efforts the Mayor has made to use existing grants has been really useful. So I have two questions. I'll ask them both.
Assembly Member Barry, did you want to ask my question? Because I'm, just carry on.
You're the next question is about building temporary accommodation, not buying it. So I'm just going to ask my question. So in terms of the new acquisitions programme, will this be new money, first of all? And secondly, the announcement said it would be about the buying and conversion of new and existing market homes into social housing and or temporary accommodation. Do you have a sense of the balance between, because this is the question, the competing priorities question, do you have a sense of the balance you'll be seeking between genuine social housing and temporary accommodation, and will each have different grant levels associated with it?
Microphone, please.
There is an announcement due very, very soon. I don't want to encourage my press colleagues to run down and turn my microphone off again. So,
I mean, arguably you should tell the Housing Committee before you tell the press.
Well, we tell everyone, and you are everyone. But yes, so there is an intention to launch a new programme very, very soon. I would look a lot happier than I do if there was new money underpinning that. So I think it won't be surprising for Assembly members to know that we are having to use the AHP for it again. and full details of the kind of conditions and requirements for local authorities will be set out imminently. And I think they will speak to some of the trade-offs that Crisis are alluding to in terms of what you then require around standards and space and etc. In terms of the balance of TA versus social rent, if you look back at the first Right to Buy Back programme, we hit about 50-50. And I think our view is very much we need to be led by local authorities here. What we're able to offer in grant will be limited because of the overall limits of the Affordable Homes programme, but it wouldn't be surprising to you to know that we would obviously look to grant fund different tenures differently. So I think it will be up to local authorities to look at their local markets and also their own temporary accommodation strategies and decide whether TA or social rent is the best tenure for them locally. But certainly historically we've seen that a mix of the two can work very well across London. And I think what we would like is to begin to have a bit of an expectation that this is part of how we house people in London. You know, speaking to the challenge just raised of landlords just not thinking about local authorities, I think if we had backing from government that say for the next 10 years there is an expectation that an affordable homes programme will value acquisitions as an appropriate proportion of that, would help to mainstream that attitudes among landlords where if you want to exit, you go to your local authority first.
No, that's great. Yeah, that idea that it's a soft landing for landlords who are sort of in distress is really important, I think, and the more it's publicised, the better, I think.
Thank you, Assemblymember. Have you done?
Thank you, Chair. I'm about to hand back to you of my own accord. Thank you.
Thank you very much, because I was going to have to beat me. Assemblymember Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. On a completely different topic, obviously, nothing to do with anything that we've just been talking about. Should temporary accommodation be classed as a form of affordable housing by the GLA so that providers can draw down funding from the AHP to build TA or, acquire it?
So I assume it's for me to say
Yes.
that. As you know, our rules are always informed by what government can allow us to do, and the expectation within the new Affordable Homes programme was that we had a much tighter restriction on tenures, so that if a product wasn't for home ownership, it was only to be social rent with the associated rents and, crucially, tenancies, which would have prevented us from funding any temporary accommodation. We are hugely aware of the scale of the crisis in London, and also the appetite for Right to Buy Back for TA showed us that there was local authority will to grow their own supply of temporary accommodation. So we have negotiated a change in the Memorandum of Understanding with DLUC, which would allow us to fund new build TA in certain circumstances. The crucial thing becomes the rent level. It would need to still be what everyone could fairly consider an affordable rent, and we would generally consider that to be the lower of either the relevant LHA level or 80% of the market rent, which I know is still in excess of a lot of what a lot of Londoners would call a genuinely affordable rent, but it's an attempt to put some parameters around that. So that provision is now there. The challenge, as ever, is all of the contextual problems that we see inhibiting new supply in general, as well as the grant rates which are available, and with the added complexity for TA, where the housing benefit revenue that local authorities can assume they will receive just isn't adequate. It's regardless of whether they're using the mainstream LHA rates or having to look at the HB specific regime, which has been frozen since 2011, making a freeze since 2020 look like very small beer. It is challenging for local authorities to work out the economics of either route, but it is a flexibility that we now have, so certainly would be very open to conversations if local authorities want to start talking to us about new build TA.
Thank you very much, Kate. So on that note, I am going to move straight on to Joanne. And in one sense, you can say this is robbing Peter to pay Paul, because the overall envelope isn't really being increased here. But do you think it gives some flexibility that would be of use, or do the issues about the overall envelope, the grant rate, and then the subsequent rental income mean that it's of insufficient value really to you?
So I think, as Kate says, we need more investment going into new supply generally. But that point said, councils do collaborate with each other to try and manage the market so that we all have agreed levels of incentive rates that we will pay landlords to offer accommodation to us and to provide that for TA and homelessness. At the beginning of the year, we agreed a 10% increase on those levels as part of our agreement. It's true to say that that 10% level has been vastly exceeded, and now we're very struggling to maintain a common agreement. So because councils are so desperate to find accommodation. So we know that there are increasing competitive pressures which are encouraging landlords and institutional providers to increase the costs to councils. So that's really affecting council budgets, and it means that we're all in competition with us. Many of our strategies include bringing under more of our direct control TA that we do own, because we know we're always going to need some TA. So I think now is the time to divert some resources to owned new build temporary accommodation for the long term, which reduces the price inflation that we're currently experiencing. So I think that would be better value for money for the taxpayer generally, and it would enable us to have more control and not be subject to market forces in the way we are at the moment.
Yes, one of the councils where I represent the constituency of Merton and Wandsworth has something that is called Costa, and it's not the coffee, it's council-owned short-term accommodation, and it's blocks that have just been turned from being a block of flats into a block of temporary accommodation. I'm not going to go into the details of my views of the quality of some of that accommodation because I have views and they're not really necessarily relevant to this part of the discussion. I just wondered if I could come along to Josie. Wow, I mean, I was working in Newham for Newham Council in the housing department 2005-06 and was there when the first discussions were had about setting up local space and how necessary it was to transform the horrible situation, I have to say, in the temporary accommodation in the private rented sector in Newham at that time. Congratulations that you've moved on to 3,000 properties, but you know it's still a drop in the ocean. Do you think switching around the AHP, obviously the initial set of properties came out of the Newham HRA, you know, would that help at all? Would that help you?
Well, grant is always helpful, however you can receive it, but the fundamental difficulties that we have around supply, around not producing enough new supply, really far outweigh all of that. And as you say, 3,000 properties, not all of them for nominations to Newham, although the majority of them are a drop in the ocean. Newham have 26,000 families on their register, so and they have about 400 voids in their council-owned social housing. So the need is enormous and very problematic for us. But we're helping. We're part of the solution. Definitely part of the solution. We're not the whole solution. No one thing is the whole solution, except producing more homes in the round, and that takes time, and takes effort, and takes sustained effort over a period of time. It all helps. And speaking from local spaces perspective specifically, we're leveraging the value of the portfolio we have. So any grant helps to make that money go further and enable us to do more. It's always helpful.
Okay, it's still very depressing though, because it doesn't really seem to have solved any of the terrible problems that were there then at that time, all those years ago. Kate, if I can come back to you, the GLA in 2019 committed up to £11 million to the PLACE project, the Pan-London Accommodation Collaborative Enterprise. Just want to make sure I get that correct, to support the building of modular housing for use as TA. And our previous colleague, Assembly Member Nikki Gavron, did a whole rapporteurship on modern methods of construction and modular housing. Obviously, one of the attractions is instead of spending 8 months building somewhere, you could spend 8 weeks getting a property ready. how many homes have now been built so far, and how much funding of the 11 million has it all been used? And what's that done to address this problem? Taking the point that everyone's making about drops in the ocean add up from different angles.
So if it's okay, I'd like to follow up in writing with the exact figures from that slice of the programme. But I think one of the things we have learned is that MMC isn't the rapid response that many people hoped it was. You still have the challenge of finding sites, so they're often meanwhile sites are a good place to start. But there are issues with the supply chain. Many members will be aware of the very high-profile collapses that have been seen with companies. There are very significant delays in getting utilities onto sites. Some other early trailblazers have found particular management challenges. So I think it's fair to say that our early experiences are probably not leading us to think that MMC is going to be a major part of the solution to get us out of the current crisis.
So has the £11 million all been spent?
I don't know, I'm afraid. As I say, I'm very happy to follow up in writing.
If you could tell us whether it has provided any accommodation. I mean, obviously the challenges are there. So my follow-on question really was to say, has all the money been used? Are we likely to expand the project? But I'm gathering from what you're saying, for temporary accommodation, probably not.
No, I mean, the money certainly has been used. As you know, we haven't handed any money back to DLUC, and we certainly don't intend to. The way we run our programmes is we are always able to redeploy grant if a particular scheme does get into trouble. But we're not planning to expand that approach at the moment, no.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question that's probably the crux of the whole meeting, but I'm going to start out by saying I think we'd all accept there's a crisis on with temporary accommodation, and that housing supply in London is too low. Bearing that in mind, what needs to happen? This question says, is it feasible there'll be significant improvement in the stock of temporary accommodation in London? The answer to that is clearly no. I don't need that answered. The question is, what needs to happen to improve the situation? Let me start with Sue. What needs to happen to change that situation?
I'm going to raise what is, I think, a controversial matter, which is about converting empty commercial buildings into residential accommodation. It's a very flawed and complex area, and there are some dreadful examples. Terminus House in Harlow is usually used as an example of what you should never do. However, Capital Letters supported a joint inquiry, APPG inquiry, so that it's the APPG for Housing and Homelessness and Housing Supply. But they reported earlier in July, which has said, in certain circumstances, very carefully and in collaboration with local authorities and housing associations, with the right building to the right standards, and we were embedding the healthy homes principles that Lord Chris was advocating for the Levelling Up Bill, there is an opportunity to create more homes, affordable homes, and the proposition was there should be a requirement that they deliver affordable homes, that we could address some of the short-term issues. And we are talking with Merton, for instance, about a block that will be used similarly. So Merton being one of our members. So there are opportunities, and there's money out there that could be invested. So we wouldn't necessarily need to use grant funding and things if we got the right partners. And what we would like to propose is perhaps we could do a pilot scheme. Perhaps the Mayor would lead a pilot to learn lessons, but also see what is the art of the possible, because it could be a solution. That work habits have changed significantly in London since the pandemic. There are lots of empty blocks of offices. The high streets are being affected by businesses going, failing. So there's opportunity to regenerate high streets, both economically and in terms of the people there. Barking and Dagenham have done an excellent project with a company called Homes for Humanities, who've been converting properties for care leavers very carefully and in small scale. So this is all small scale to a degree, but there is potentially opportunities to create more homes without affecting or having to have new build. And actually, these buildings have already got carbon capture, so it helps with the net zero aspirations of the Mayor also. So I think there's something there that's worth exploring, but absolutely caveating that it has to be done very carefully and in collaboration with the local authorities to make sure there's no impact on local amenities, and all of those considerations are given proper thought before anything's done.
Yeah, many members on this committee have a visceral dislike,
and
I would say, of permitted development.
And I'm not talking about PDR necessarily, I'm talking about conversion of properties, which is different to
Okay, my committee members have persuaded me that mightn't. I'd be interested to see how that would look, because we have had extensive conversations about that sort of development, and none of them have been positive. Can I come to Kate?
So what was the big thing that needs to be done?
Yeah, give me one wish list.
So I think I would start with local housing allowance. A lot of what we've been talking about is about the flow, it's about small numbers. If you increase local housing allowance, including that specific HB subsidy, you are helping huge numbers of Londoners at a stroke. You're stopping the flow of people into temporary accommodation, because you're dealing with the affordability crisis, which is making people homeless from the PRS. You're getting people out of TA into good quality private rented sector accommodation, and you're helping local authorities to find decent TA rather than having to rely on hotels, bed and breakfast, out of area, etc. So LHA is probably the closest we have to a magic wand in the short term.
Could you remind me of the minimum level you suggested earlier?
So at a minimum, the 30th percentile, which is what's been nominally the kind of policy norm for the last decade. But I think if you look historically, if you look at the evidence, probably in London you need something closer to the median rent to actually enable the private rented sector to function. And as Josie says, it needs to be in conjunction with the benefit cap, because not everyone is working, so some people will be subject to the benefit cap.
Okay, thank you. Joanne?
Yes, local authorities would absolutely support LHA, but if I can add a new one, taking that as read, councils need an urgent injection of additional finance to support the current cost pressures that they're experiencing. So at Enfield this year we are incurring 17 million in addition to our planned budget for the provision of homelessness support and temporary accommodation, and many councils across London are in similar positions, indeed across the country. So the homelessness prevention grant formula had an element of cost in terms of how it allocates funding, but that cost was based on 2021 and the previous 2 years. Clearly, since that time, cost pressures have increased exponentially. So there's an urgent need to address that gap to enable councils to survive and to continue to deliver their statutory service. In addition to that, we've got a workforce which is absolutely vital to provide the support to residents. It's a workforce in short supply, so there's a real lack of trained caseworkers across London, and we're competing with each other for the best caseworkers. We really need a workforce development plan, because it's an important and professional career path, and that needs to be supported by funding to enable us to grow the pipeline of caseworkers that we need to provide support to residents at this time.
Okay, Dinah?
So I'm supporting the local housing allowance point that you'd expect me to from the previous responses. But I think also it needs to be done in the short term, but it won't impact for a longer term. There needs to be a look at across the piece at a treasury level in terms of funding, so that we look at the spend that is going into temporary accommodation, and we look at how we could use that money more efficiently as capital spend. Which I think, again, people have talked about in terms of issues of delivering affordable housing on the ground in the short term from acquisitions and in the longer term from increasing supply. And I think there's a lot of work that could be done at a national level on public health side as well, to actually show that that capital investment does not cost money, because it saves money.
But if I was at the Treasury, I'd argue you're asking me to find quite a serious sum of money quite immediately.
Yeah, and the short-term reason that is worth doing from the Treasury point of view, I live with a Treasury economist, so I get asked these questions all the time. Is the short-term answer is in terms of the acquisitions, because then you get an immediate switch from somebody being paid through DWP and all the health costs, straight to being on a social rent. So there's an immediate saving that comes from putting somebody to providing somebody with an acquisitioned property rather than a new build. That's the sort of short term. You do that, and then in the longer term, that capital flow is actually saving you money, because you're not making the spend on the DWP costs and the NHS costs. It's because we don't look at all of this expenditure across the piece, and we see it departmentally.
Yeah, we do silos, don't we? No municipal budgets in this country. I know. I'm going to quickly go to Kate, then I'll go to Josie.
Yeah, I think because many of us have had these conversations with Treasury over the years, and I think one important thing to note is London is the only region where this stacks up. It is in London where, because of the very high cost of rents, you start to get the more immediate payback. So I think actually maybe part of what we need to do is to be being comfortable with making the case that London is a special case, because when Treasury looks at this as a national level, it becomes less attractive. But if you focus in on London, the acuteness of our crisis changes the maths.
And the costs.
And the costs.
Okay, Josie?
I'm certainly not going to disagree with LHA being the absolute critical matter. I think that currently LHA covers is about the 18th centile. So that's really low, isn't it? So yes, that's the biggest single thing that would quickly make any change. But it's how we fund acquisition or building of new homes, and we need to understand that investment in infrastructure, and this is infrastructure, gives us very large long-term savings. But as you say, there isn't this coordinated view of what it actually costs for somebody to be living in unstable temporary accommodation, because the cost isn't just about the cost of the accommodation to the local authority, it's also the cost of the health service and all of the other long-term implications for the children who grow up in really poor quality accommodation, who don't function, don't do well at school, who don't economically do as well as they could. All of those things could be quantified if we were minded to do so.
Okay, thank you.
So it's about how you make that case, I think.
Okay. Assembly Member Devonish.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, panel. My first question is to Joanne and Sue. How effective are services such as capital letters given current conditions in the private rental sector? And please feel free not to say what you've already said before because of time pressures. Thank you.
Shall I let Sue go first, and then I'll respond as a member borough?
So capital letters were set up originally with the GLA support and the Mayor's support, and then DULUC funding, to principally find PRS properties to enable our members to discharge duty. So in our heyday, ironically during lockdown, so the LHA rate had gone up at 2020, so that encouraged landlords to stay in the market, but a lot of people had left London, so there was a dearth of demand. So we were able to make hay, shall we say, and we were getting 400, 450 properties a month that we were offering to our member boroughs. We're now getting 25 or so a month. So we might get to 300 this year in its entirety, because there are just not any LHA level properties available, and we only procure at LHA level. 2-year AST to enable tenants to put down secure routes as much as possible, so it's secure and stable accommodation. There are just not enough homes in London. We've rehearsed that already. As I said, there were 17 properties at the end of October available at LHA level that you won't have gone at LHL level. So unless we crack the supply issue, short term and long term, we aren't going to make a difference. We ended up contracting our membership because we had 19 members until the beginning of this financial year. And in the light of the properties we could procure, nobody was getting enough. So we're now down to 10 members, Enfield being one of our members, Merton another. So what we are able to procure is being distributed to a smaller number. What has worked really well, though, is it's the pan-London collaboration. So we procure all over London. We offer the properties to our members. They either accept or reject them, depending on the needs that they have at a given point in time. We agreed a standard incentive level for PRS accommodation. So there was already one for temporary accommodation, but we agreed with our members a standard incentive rate, so that dampened the market, it stopped the competition between members. So, as I said, when there were properties to procure, it worked really well. It's extraordinarily challenging, and I've just had to make a really difficult business decision to reduce my team because I haven't got enough work for them at the moment because there are not properties to procure.
Yes, as a borough like Enfield, which has got a relatively more affordable housing market, we are a net importer of other boroughs using our stock for temporary accommodation. So the thing that we really like about the model that Capital Letters has developed is that they offer homes first to the host borough. And that's very important to us. So whilst Capital Letters has struggled, as we all have with the market, that principle of keeping homes available for local residents in borough is a really strong point about the Capital Letters model.
Thank you. And my second and final question, should there be another London level letting agency like Capital Letters and supported by the GLA, but for individuals rather than families? And that's to Kate, then Joanne, and then Sue.
I mean, I think what we've just heard points to a very strong answer on that now is probably a very difficult time to go into the market and be procuring additional accommodation. So, as ever at the GLA, we want to hear from local authorities. We want to stand ready to support them. But I think we are very, very minded of the challenges in the market at the moment. But if local authorities tell us that is an intervention they would welcome, we could certainly look to support it in the way we did with the launch of Capital Letters.
Support any initiative to address the needs of single people. I think now is the right time to set up new vehicles and new organisations because the market just isn't there, as Kate said. But creative solutions to address single people's homelessness needs, absolutely.
So originally we were set up wholly for families and households with children because it was felt there were a lot of initiatives for single people at the time, but nothing specifically for families. We would be very happy to expand our remit into other areas if we can add value and if we can find properties. I think Joanne's right, setting up yet another vehicle in the current environment probably doesn't make sense, but actually expanding our range of responsibilities may well do. Maybe we'd look to get some additional funding to do so. We have just set up our own lettings agency, so we are offering services for landlords and indeed individuals, so we could use that vehicle within our existing business to perhaps do something different.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Barry, we are very pushed for time, Assembly Member. Brevity would be appreciated.
I'll be as quick as I can. So, starting with Joanne, I think, because I think you're the most relevant person here. And if anyone else wants to join in, please put your hand up. Then we won't have to come to all of you if we don't have to. We had a lot of conversations in the previous session here about the poor standards in temporary accommodation. And I wanted to ask what you think needs to be done in terms of better regulation or better support to enforce standards to make that happen. In particular, asking how that might interact with setting the standard, which is Pan-London, does inspections, but only on sort of nightly paid temporary accommodation.
So I think, as the point has been made, that the type of accommodation we can afford to pay for and that is affordable for residents is at the lower end of the market, and landlords struggle to invest the level of capital resources required to keep a property up to modern day standards. So it is very much a product of the market, really. I think that there is a really important role for licensing schemes and the private sector enforcement function to both provide support and advice and guidance to landlords, as well as taking action when standards aren't where they need to be. Certainly, as a local authority, we have property managers that do seek assurance about health and safety standards and ensure that we take up repair matters and all the issues that were raised in the previous session with the landlord, and we also offer them a repair service at cost. So we do many things to encourage landlords to maintain their homes, but it is a challenging area, and of course we don't want to have temporary accommodation and the need for that. So ultimately we want to increase quality permanent homes, and that's where we want to put our investment.
Okay, who else would like to comment on the really appalling stories that we heard about bad standards in the previous session? Thank you, Dinah.
I mean, I don't know whether I can find you a solution, but I think there might be something to do with the quality of stock generally in the UK that we've allowed nationally to fall to the levels that they have. I think I'd just say, really, from the London Housing Panel's point of view, the standards should be the same for everyone, regardless of who your landlord is, the pathway into finding that home, or your immigration status, and to somehow, as a nation, to be accepting that people should be able to be homed in housing that is different because you're in a particular group just doesn't seem humane.
Great, thank you. I saw Kate first and then Sue.
So I think we very much recognise what Joanne says around the pressures in the market and the behaviours that drives. And as Dinah says, we are dealing with an underlying stock to pull from, which is inadequate. I think we do need to kind of challenge ourselves to go further, though, and that is why when we launched Right to Buy Back 1, we included the very deliberate decision to require that homes brought into it, regardless of whether it was for TA or social rent, but they had to be brought up to the decent home standard. If they were going to be used for TA, they had to remain in borough, and I think that speaks to that awareness as the trade-off we were talking about earlier of when you're using grant. There is a direct trade-off between new social rent supply and TA, and we have put conditions on local authorities which have undoubtedly made it harder for them to procure temporary accommodation, but that's felt like the right balance to strike when you hear the very, very challenging accounts that we heard earlier.
Can I ask you, Kate, does the Renters Reform Bill have the answer to this? Because if this, I mean, at the moment, the danger is that the landlord will escape from our clutches and go off into the wider private rented sector, but if they weren't able to rent out to other tenants without bringing it up to standard, that would solve our problem too, wouldn't it?
I think we're still waiting for the detail of how the government intends to apply the decent home standard to the PRS, and crucially what they haven't addressed at all is the question of funding, and it is a really difficult balance around whether you want to put public money into incentives and the risk that landlords will kind of be flipping out of that market, or whether you sort of rely on market economics driving it.
Yeah, it's multi-level, isn't it? So you want temporary accommodation to be of a good standard. If they can't then escape to the private rented sector more generally, then that helps.
Yeah.
If they want to exit the market as a whole, we need the soft landing. So, yeah. Okay, Sue, you wanted to join in as well.
Just very briefly, and this isn't particularly about TA, but Capital Letters inspects every single property before we offer it to a member borough, and we inspect it against standards that we've agreed with our members about what is suitable accommodation, so health and safety, but amenities, space, standards we have to measure every room. So if that could be applied, perhaps expanding the role of setting the standards, or indeed Capital Letters doing it, we'd be very happy to do an inspection service for London, if that is the answer. What we found until recently is landlords were quite open to doing any repair work we might have identified it, because they knew they were going to get a tenant and that we were going to support the tenant. So that was a quid pro quo, if you like. If there were grant funding available for landlords to repair the properties or stuff, that would perhaps incentivise more of them to come back to the market. Whether it's TA or PRS, I think that might be part of the solution. And EPC rating and such like.
That's a really handy offer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Assembly member, need to.
I was going to move to the next question, question 18, as discussed on the message system that we use.
Yes, but be quick.
Thank you. Going back to empty homes that was mentioned earlier, there is a proposal coming, a project from the G15, they're calling Project 123, which is looking at, I don't know what we call it really, empty properties in places like estates due to be demolished, and other sort of meanwhile sites, and unmortgageable properties which are otherwise basically safe but can't be mortgaged because of fire safety concerns. What do you think of that? Starting with Kate, maybe, who's probably the most aware of it already.
Yeah, so both Joanne and I have been talking to the G15 about this project. It's at very early stages, but I think the positive thing is it recognises that collective will from both large housing associations, councils and the mayor to try and find solutions. So what the G15 have been doing is looking at their available empty stock and seeing whether any of it could be repurposed for temporary accommodation. There's lots and lots of ideas in the mix at the moment, and I think it's now at the stage where it's for members to look at what's going to produce stock at scale, and what is going to comply with what everyone feels is appropriate for the households that we're talking about. So I think, you know, there would be genuine discussions to be had around the use of stock which has been identified with fire safety defects, stock which is due for demolition. You know, I think there were some very testing conversations to be had there, but other routes that have been identified, unsold shared ownership, high value voids where they'd otherwise be sold at auction, you know, there is real potential to bring some stock back into use for social rent or TA, otherwise it will be lost to either, you know, private rent, highest bidder, etc.
I think we're quite grateful no one else wants to weigh in there, aren't we?
Thank you.
There's one very, very quick point here that one of the panel members is focused on empty homes and I think would be a very good partner to assist in some of that thinking, because they've done a lot of thinking about empty homes across the capital and across the country.
For clarity, you mean the London Housing Panel that you chair? Yeah, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you. I think I know what Sue Edmonds' view and Capital Letters' view is of this, because you started talking about it earlier, so I'm not going to ask you this question. However, I am going to ask Josie Pearson's and then Kate Webb. And it's, should the GLA follow the recommendation from Capital Letters to pilot a small, affordable-led development of commercial to residential conversions in partnership with local councils and housing associations? What do you think about that, Josie?
I've never been against the idea of permitted development or conversion of commercial.
I think this isn't permitted development, which
or
like
conversion
a whole block
of conversion of commercial buildings. It's about, as Sue said, the right building in the right place, done to the right standard, with all of the other considerations around what that place is. And doing that on a pilot basis seems like a really good way, so that you can try it in a small way and learn lessons before you
replicate it all over London.
Exactly.
In fact, actually, just before I bring in Kate, Joanne, if the GLA came to you and said, there's an office block that's been, you know, empty for 5 years in the centre of, I don't know, Edmonton, let's say, because it's near the incinerator. No, that was this morning's meeting. You know, if they came along and said, you know, would you like to turn it into accommodation rather than having it lying around with nothing to do, what would you say?
Obviously, quality and the ability to bring quality forward in a viable way is critical. But yes, we need as much accommodation as we can, so we wouldn't rule out anything done in the right way.
So you're getting some yeses there. So, Kate, what's the view from the GLA of this as a sort of pilot project, and then possibly replicating it if it works?
So I think it's very helpful that we've clarified that we're not talking about PDR.
We're not.
Because that does not work in a way that brings forward quality. I think our focus would still be on the quality of accommodation, and is this going to be housing which is generally going to work for residents. I think generally in terms of how we work, we tend not to turn up at Joanne and others' doors knocking on it offering bags of cash. We're very much partner-led. So if housing associations or local authorities are identifying commercial stock locally and want to come and talk to us, our door is always open for those innovative discussions. But I think it is fair to say that we don't start from a a history of very positive office to resi conversions, so there will be a lot of scoping to be done. But if local authorities and HAs think there is genuine opportunity there, they should always come and talk to us. But I think it is notable at the moment we're not being inundated with requests to talk about this.
Okay, I can see that Sue is keen to say something very brief, though.
I promise very brief. Just to say that we are actually in discussions with an investor to do a commercial to resi conversion at the bottom of a tower block. So we're going to take some properties in the tower block, which will be LHA, and then there are commercial units at the bottom of the block that we're going to convert into probably market rent due to the type of accommodation it is. But it'll be an exemplar that, again, if you talk to Barking and Dagenham, you can look at what they're doing with Homes and Humanities. And I think there's something there that we should explore. We can't ignore it, and we need to take every opportunity.
I do think the quality issue is really important, because I have actually visited some conversions that I don't think had even been run past the local authority, and beds in sheds, which we also discussed earlier on, would have been preferable to the squalor that I saw there. So anyway, thank you for sharing that. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember Cooper. I've got to say we're in such need that everything needs to be tested, doesn't it? And if it's going to be done correctly by professionals, by committed housing professionals, who knows what we could achieve. But yes, the need is huge. Let me say thank you to our guests for all your contributions today. I say this genuinely, been a real education. It's been really great to sit here and listen to your experience come across. It's been very, very helpful indeed. You are released to the wild unless you want to sit and go through our formal business with us. You're welcome to stay. It'll only take 2 minutes. And anyway, can we note the report and today's discussion?
Noted.
Can we delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group leads to agree any output arising from the discussion?
Agreed.
Can we note our work programme for the 2023-2024 Assembly year, noting that since the agenda's publication, it has been agreed with group lead members that the build to rent topic will be moved from the February to the January meeting slot, and that the February meeting slot topic will now be on housing delivery on GLA group land.
Noted.
The date of the next meeting of this committee is scheduled for the 6th of December 2023 at 10 a.m. in the committee rooms 2 and 3 at City Hall. I have no urgent business. I declare this meeting closed.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.